Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I need to tell someone about what happened with our downstairs neighbor because the police won't do anything, and I'm losing my mind. We're a pretty normal family. Me, my wife Jenna, and our 2 kids who were 7 and 4 at the time. I worked nights at a warehouse distribution center in Cincinnati, while Jenna stayed home with the children. Our apartment was on the 2nd floor of this old brick building from the 60s, one of those places with 8 units, creaky wooden floors, and windows that rattled whenever a truck rumbled past. We'd lived there for about 3 years without any real issues, just the occasional maintenance problem, and thin walls that let you hear too much of everyone else's business. Most of our neighbors were friendly enough, the kind where you'd chat about the weather while checking your mail, but the guy directly below us, Mr. Garrett, always kept his distance. Heavy-set man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair, and he had this peculiar habit of wearing the same faded blue coveralls every single day, like he'd just clocked out from some factory that shut down 20 years ago. The weird stuff started small, almost easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. One Saturday afternoon, we came back from grocery shopping to find our front door unlocked. Jenna insisted she'd locked it, and I believed her because she was the type to check the knob twice before walking away. We brushed it off, figured maybe one of us got distracted with the kids arguing about who got to push the cart or something. Then the next week, same thing with the door, but this time our kitchen window was cracked open about 2 inches. That window faced the dumpster area, and we never opened it, especially not in early spring when it was still chilly. Our coffee maker had migrated from its spot next to the toaster to the opposite counter, and the kids' artwork on the refrigerator looked different, like someone had taken them down and put them back up in new positions. These weren't huge violations, but Jenna and I exchanged that look married couples get when they both realize something's not adding up. We started keeping a notebook, writing down every strange occurrence. The bathroom faucet we always made sure to turn off completely would be dripping when we got home. Our bedroom closet door, which we kept closed because the kids liked to play hide and seek in there and mess up our clothes, would be wide open. The worst part was this smell that would hit us randomly, like someone had been smoking cheap cigars mixed with some kind of industrial cleaner. It would linger in different rooms, strongest near the heating vents. Jenna found her grandmother's jewelry box, which she kept on our dresser, turned completely around facing the wall. Nothing was missing, but someone had definitely been handling it because her rings were in the wrong compartments. I installed one of those chain locks on our door, the kind hotels have, thinking that would solve the problem. We even changed our routine, started coming home at different times to throw off anyone who might be watching our schedule. About 3 weeks into this madness, I decided to come home early from my shift. Told my supervisor I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't exactly a lie considering the stress was eating me alive. I parked around the corner instead of our usual spot and walked up the back stairwell real quiet. When I got to our floor, I heard footsteps inside our apartment. Slow, deliberate, like someone taking their time. My key was already in my hand when I heard our door click shut. I rushed around the corner just in time to see Mr. Garrett's door closing on the floor below. The hallway still had that same chemical and cigar smell hanging in the air. I stood there for a good minute, trying to process what just happened, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I finally went inside our apartment, our mail was spread out on the kitchen table, sorted into neat little piles, and every single cabinet door in the kitchen was standing open. I called Jenna immediately, told her to keep the kids at her mother's house for the night. Then I marched straight down to Mr. Garrett's door and pounded on it until my fist hurt. I could hear his TV through the door, some game show with canned laughter, and I knew he was in there. After about 5 minutes, he finally opened up, but only as far as the chain would allow. His face appeared in the gap, sweaty and blotchy, with these watery blue eyes that wouldn't quite meet mine. He was wearing those same coveralls, and up close I could smell that exact combination of stale cigar and chemical cleaner coming from his apartment. I asked him point blank if he'd been in our place, and he just stared at me with this blank expression, like I was speaking a foreign language. Then he said, real slow and deliberate, that he didn't know what I was talking about, that he'd been home all day watching his programs. Before I could say another word, he shut the door in my face. I heard multiple locks clicking into place, way more than any normal person would need. That night I barely slept, sitting in our living room with a baseball bat across my lap, listening to every creak and groan of the building. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and measured, stopping right outside our door. The footsteps just stayed there for what must have been 10 minutes, not moving, not trying the handle, just standing. I crept to the peephole but couldn't see anyone. They were standing just outside the field of view. Then I heard breathing, heavy and ragged, right up against our door. The chain lock rattled slightly, like someone was testing it from the outside. I grabbed my phone to record it, but as soon as the camera app opened with that little clicking sound, the footsteps hurried away. When I finally worked up the nerve to crack the door open and peek out, the hallway was empty except for a wet rag on our doormat, soaked in something that burned my nostrils when I got close to it. The next morning I went straight to the landlord's office with Jenna. Mr. Thompson, this skinny guy in his 70s who always wore suspenders and smelled like mothballs, listened to our story while clicking his pen repeatedly against his desk. He told us Mr. Garrett had been there for 15 years, never missed rent, never caused problems. When we insisted someone had been entering our apartment, he just shrugged and said we had no proof it was Garrett, that maybe we were being forgetful with the kids and all. He wouldn't change our locks without charging us, and he definitely wasn't going to confront a long-term tenant based on accusations. As we were leaving his office, he mentioned something that made my skin prickle. He said Garrett used to be the building's maintenance man years ago, before they hired an outside company. The man still had a master key from those days, claimed he'd lost it, but Thompson never bothered getting the locks changed because Garrett was such a reliable tenant. We called the police that afternoon, and 2 officers showed up about 3 hours later looking bored before we even started talking. They took notes while we explained everything, but I could see the skepticism in their faces when we couldn't show them anything stolen or broken. The younger cop, this kid who looked fresh out of academy with his perfectly pressed uniform, actually suggested we might be experiencing shared delusions from stress. The older one at least went downstairs to talk to Garrett, but came back up after 5 minutes saying the man denied everything and seemed confused by the accusations. They gave us a case number and told us to call if anything else happened, but made it clear that without evidence of forced entry or stolen property, there wasn't much they could do. As they were leaving, I noticed Garrett standing at the bottom of the stairwell, just watching us with this satisfied expression, like he knew exactly how this would play out. Things escalated fast after the police visit. The next day, our car had all 4 tires deflated. Not slashed, just the air let out, so technically no vandalism. When I was filling them back up at the gas station, I found sugar poured into the gas tank. The mechanic said we were lucky we didn't try to start it. That same evening, Garrett started having people over, which he'd never done in the 3 years we'd lived there. These weren't normal guests either, rough-looking guys with neck tattoos and motorcycles who'd park right behind our car, blocking us in. They'd sit on the front steps drinking and talking loud until 2 or 3 in the morning, always glancing up at our windows when we peeked through the curtains. Jenna found a dead pigeon on our doormat one morning, its neck twisted completely around. The kids were asking why we couldn't go outside to play anymore, why Mommy was crying so much, why we had to be so quiet all the time. We started finding those chemical-soaked rags wedged into our bathroom vent while we slept, filling the apartment with fumes that made us dizzy and nauseous. I tried confronting Garrett again, this time with my phone recording in my pocket. He answered the door immediately, like he'd been waiting, and this time he didn't bother with the chain. He stood there in those filthy coveralls, smiling with teeth that were brown from tobacco, and told me real calm that he'd lived in this building longer than anyone, that he knew every pipe, every wire, every way in and out. He said sometimes people who don't belong somewhere start having accidents, kitchen fires, gas leaks, that sort of thing. Then he leaned in close enough that I could smell his rancid breath and whispered that my kids sure were pretty, that it would be a shame if something happened while I was at work and Jenna was all alone with them. He knew our schedules, knew when I left for my night shifts, knew what school the kids went to, knew what playground they used. He'd been watching us for years, collecting information, waiting for some perceived slight to give him a reason. We called the police again, played them the recording from my pocket, but the audio was muffled and hard to make out. They said it wasn't enough for a restraining order, that his words could be interpreted different ways, that we needed more concrete evidence of threats or harassment. The officer actually suggested we consider moving if we felt unsafe, like it was that simple to just pack up and leave when we could barely afford the deposit on a new place. That night we found our door lock had been superglued while we were inside, trapping us until I could get the super to drill it out the next morning. Garrett's biker friends started following Jenna when she drove the kids to school, staying just far enough behind to avoid being called tailgating. We'd see them at the grocery store, at the park, always watching, never quite doing anything illegal enough for the cops to care. The chemical smell was getting stronger in our apartment, seeping through vents we didn't even know existed, and both kids developed persistent coughs that wouldn't go away. The breaking point came on a Friday night when I was at work. Jenna called me hysterical, saying she'd woken up to find Garrett standing in our bedroom doorway, just silhouetted against the hall light, watching her sleep. She screamed and he walked out calm as could be, didn't run, didn't hurry, just strolled out like he had every right to be there. The police came again, found our front door lock had been picked, finally had their evidence of breaking and entering. They arrested Garrett that night, but he posted bail the next morning. We packed what we could fit in our car and left that same day, stayed with Jenna's mother for 2 months while we found a new place 3 towns over. We broke our lease, lost our security deposit, had to borrow money for a new apartment. The landlord actually had the nerve to threaten us with legal action for abandoning the property. We never went back for the rest of our stuff. Sometimes I drive by that old building and I swear I can see him in his window, those same coveralls, just waiting for the next family to move in upstairs. The police told us the case was dropped due to insufficient evidence since we wouldn't return to testify. We just wanted it over, wanted our kids to sleep through the night again without asking if the bad man was coming back. It was early October when I moved into that rental room on Willow Avenue, just outside of Portland. I'd just landed a job at a medical billing company downtown, and after weeks of searching, I finally found this affordable room in a quiet suburban house owned by an elderly couple, the Johnsons. They lived on the main floor while I had a cozy room upstairs with its own entrance through the back stairs. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes, people walking their dogs in the evening. I remember feeling lucky to have found such a peaceful spot, especially after living in a noisy apartment complex near campus for the past 4 years. The Johnsons were sweet, always checking if I needed anything, and their cat, a massive orange tabby named Clementine, would sometimes sneak up to my room and curl up on my bed while I worked from home on Fridays. The first few weeks were uneventful, almost boring in that comfortable suburban way. I'd wake up at 6:30, make coffee in my tiny kitchenette, and head to work. Evenings were for jogging around the neighborhood or reading on the small balcony attached to my room. It was during one of those evening jogs, about 3 weeks after moving in, that I first really noticed the house next door. The paint was peeling off the siding. The grass was overgrown with dandelions taking over what used to be flower beds, and there were always different cars parked in the driveway, beat-up sedans that would appear for a day or two then vanish. The mailbox was stuffed so full that envelopes were falling onto the ground, but what really caught my attention was the woman sitting on the front steps, smoking and staring directly at me as I jogged past. She had stringy blonde hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks, wore an oversized flannel shirt despite the warm evening, and her eyes had this hollow, desperate quality that made me pick up my pace. A few days later, I was carrying groceries from my car when she appeared at the fence separating our properties. "Hey, neighbor," she called out, her voice raspy and too loud. "I'm Diane. Been living here for 8 years, never seen you before." Her fingers gripped the chain-link fence, knuckles white, and I noticed her nails were bitten down to the quick with dried blood around the edges. I introduced myself politely, trying to balance my grocery bags while maintaining some distance. She immediately launched into this rapid-fire monologue about how her ex-husband had left her with nothing, how the government was screwing her over with disability payments, how her daughter never visited anymore. The words tumbled out in a rush, like water breaking through a dam. She kept stepping closer to the fence, and I could smell something sour on her breath even from several feet away. Then, without any transition, she asked if I could lend her $40 for groceries, said she'd pay me back on Friday when her check came in. Before I could respond, Mr. Johnson appeared on our back porch, calling out that he needed help moving something inside. I'd never been more grateful for an interruption. I apologized to Diane, said I had to go, and practically ran toward the house. As I reached the porch, Mr. Johnson pulled me aside, his usually cheerful face serious. "You need to be careful with her," he said quietly, glancing toward the fence where Diane still stood watching us. "She's been trouble for years. Last month she borrowed Peggy's car from across the street, said it was just for a grocery run, and didn't bring it back for 3 days. Peggy found it abandoned at a gas station 20 miles away with an empty tank and fast food wrappers everywhere. He told me that Diane had a pattern. She'd be friendly at first, find out everything about you, then the requests would start. Small things initially, then bigger asks, and if you refused, she could turn nasty. The previous tenant, a college kid named Brandon, had moved out after just 2 months because Diane wouldn't stop knocking on his door at all hours, demanding rides to places or asking to use his phone. For the next couple of weeks, I managed to avoid any real interaction with Diane. I'd see her through my window sometimes, pacing her backyard while talking loudly on her phone, gesturing wildly at no one. Other times she'd be sitting on her porch with different people, rough-looking men with neck tattoos, women who seemed just as strung out as she was. They'd argue frequently, voices carrying through the thin walls between our houses. I started wearing headphones constantly, even when I wasn't listening to anything, just to have an excuse to ignore her if she tried to talk to me. But she was persistent. She'd appear at the fence whenever I came home from work, always with a new crisis. Her electricity was about to be shut off. Her medication had been stolen. She needed a ride to the pharmacy. Each time I'd make up an excuse. I was late for something, I had a work call, I wasn't feeling well. I could see her getting more agitated with each rejection, her friendly mask slipping just a little more. Then came that Wednesday evening in late October. I'd just gotten home from a particularly stressful day at work, dealing with insurance claims and angry patients. All I wanted was to heat up some leftover pasta and watch Netflix in peace. I was halfway up my back stairs when I heard her voice behind me. "Hey, wait up." Diane was standing at the bottom of my stairs. She'd actually come through the gate into our backyard. She looked worse than usual, her hair greasy and matted, wearing the same stained sweatpants I'd seen her in for the past 3 days. Her pupils were like pinpoints, and she kept scratching at her arms, leaving red marks on her pale skin. "I really need your help," she said, already starting up the stairs toward me. "Just for tonight, I promise. My cousin kicked me out, and I just need somewhere to crash for a few hours until my friend gets off work." The desperation in her voice was mixed with something else, an edge of aggression that made my pulse quicken. I told her firmly that I couldn't help, that she needed to leave our property, but she kept coming up the stairs, now talking faster, saying she knew I had extra space, that neighbors were supposed to help each other. I managed to get inside and lock the door just as she reached the top of the stairs. She immediately started pounding on it, not knocking but really hammering with her fists. I know you're in there. Open up. I just need help. The door shook with each impact. I told her through the door that she needed to leave or I'd call the police. That's when she completely lost it. The pounding turned into kicks, and her yelling became screaming. Raw, primal sounds mixed with curses and accusations. She called me every name imaginable, said I was just like everyone else, that I'd regret this. I could hear Mr. Johnson shouting from somewhere below, telling her to get off his property, but she ignored him. I grabbed my phone and called 911, trying to stay calm as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. Through my bedroom window, I could see her now attacking my door with what looked like a garden rake she'd grabbed from somewhere, the metal tines scraping against the wood. The dispatcher said officers were on their way, but those minutes felt like hours. Eventually, I heard sirens approaching and the pounding stopped. I peeked through the blinds and saw Diane running back toward her house, tossing the rake into our yard. 2 police cars pulled up, and I went down to talk to them, still shaking from the adrenaline. The officers took my statement, then went next door to talk to Diane. I could hear her through the walls, playing victim, crying about how she just needed help, and I'd overreacted. But the officers had dealt with her before. I could tell from their tired expressions when they came back. They said they'd warned her about trespassing and told her to stay away from our property. One officer, a younger guy with kind eyes, suggested I get a restraining order if she bothered me again. After they left, I couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything. I just sat on my bed, listening to every sound from next door, wondering if she'd come back. Around midnight, I finally heard her house go quiet, but I barely slept, jumping at every creak and rustle outside. The next morning started with an eerie calm. I'd finally dozed off around 4 a.m. and woke up at 7 to birds chirping and sunlight streaming through my blinds. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that maybe last night had been the end of it, that Diane had gotten the message. I made coffee with trembling hands, exhausted but needing to get ready for work. Through my kitchen window, I could see her house look dark and still, no movement behind the torn curtains. I was gathering my work bag when I heard it, screaming from next door, but different from last night. This was pure rage, furniture crashing, glass breaking. Then a man's voice, deep and panicked, yelling, "Stop! Put it down! Diane, stop!" More crashing, then a woman's scream. Not Diane's voice, someone younger. I ran to my window and saw a young woman, maybe early 20s, stumbling out of Diane's front door, holding her arm. Blood was seeping through her fingers, staining her white shirt red. She collapsed on the front lawn, and the man, tall, heavy-set, wearing a mechanic's uniform, came running out after her, his face pale with shock. I called 911 again, my voice cracking as I tried to explain what I was seeing. Other neighbors were coming out of their houses now, Peggy from across the street still in her bathrobe, the Nguyens from 2 houses down, everyone gathering but keeping their distance. The man was kneeling beside the woman, pressing his jacket against her arm, talking to her in a low, urgent voice. I could hear him saying, "It's okay, Katie, help's coming. Stay with me." Through Diane's open front door, I could see chaos inside. Overturned furniture, something that looked like a broken mirror scattered across the floor. Then Diane appeared in the doorway, holding what looked like a kitchen knife, her face contorted with rage. Mascara from last night streaked down her cheeks in black rivers. She was screaming about betrayal, about family who didn't care, about everyone being against her. The man stood up, positioning himself between Diane and the injured woman, his hands raised, pleading with her to put the knife down. But she just stood there in the doorway, waving it around, ranting about money they owed her, about promises they'd broken, about how Katie had stolen from her. The sirens came fast this time. Multiple police cars, an ambulance, even a fire truck. The whole street lit up with red and blue lights reflecting off windows and casting strange shadows everywhere. Officers surrounded Diane's house, weapons drawn, shouting commands for her to drop the knife. She retreated inside, slamming the door. And for a few tense minutes there was a standoff. The paramedics rushed to Katie, loading her onto a gurney while the man, who I learned later was Diane's brother Kevin, gave them information about what happened. He kept saying it was his fault, that he shouldn't have brought Katie there, that he just wanted to check on his sister after hearing about last night's incident from the landlord. The police used a megaphone trying to talk Diane out, but she was screaming from inside, incoherent now, throwing things against the windows. Finally, after what felt like forever but was probably only 20 minutes, she came out. No knife, hands raised but still ranting, spitting at the officers as they cuffed her. Her feet were bare and bleeding, probably from the broken mirror, leaving bloody footprints on the concrete as they led her to the police car. The aftermath was surreal. The entire street was blocked off with yellow tape, detectives going in and out of Diane's house, taking pictures, carrying out evidence bags. I gave my statement to 3 different officers, including details about the night before. Peggy told them about the car incident. The Nguyens mentioned the numerous times they'd called in noise complaints. Everyone had a story about Diane. Kevin sat on the curb for hours, head in his hands, occasionally answering questions from detectives. I heard him tell one officer that Diane had been struggling with meth for years, that the family had tried interventions, rehab, everything, but she always relapsed. Katie was his daughter, Diane's niece, and she just wanted to help her aunt, had even been letting Diane borrow money despite Kevin telling her not to. The knife attack happened when Katie finally said no to giving her $500 for rent that morning. By afternoon, the street was quiet again, but different. We all knew each other now in a way we hadn't before, bonded by this shared trauma. Diane's house stood empty, door sealed with police tape, a reminder of how quickly things could spiral. I moved out 2 weeks later, found a studio apartment downtown that cost twice as much, but felt infinitely safer. Sometimes I still dream about that morning. The blood on the white shirt, the broken glass, the sound of Diane's bare feet on concrete as they took her away. The scraping of metal against frozen dirt at 3 a.m. isn't a sound you forget. That winter of 2015, I was renting this small house on Birch Street in a tiny Michigan town, the kind of place where the local diner still had the same menu from 1987, and everybody pretended they weren't gossiping about their neighbors while buying milk at the corner store. I'd moved there after my divorce, taking night shifts at the hospital as a radiology tech, which meant I kept odd hours and noticed things other people missed. 2 houses down from me lived Mr. Carlson, this guy in his 60s who never trimmed his hedges and whose mailbox was always overflowing with yellowed newspapers. The other neighbors had given up trying to be friendly with him years ago. He'd just stare at you with these pale gray eyes if you tried to make conversation, never saying a word, just waiting until you got uncomfortable enough to walk away. The digging started right after the first hard frost in November, when the ground should have been too solid to work with. I came home from my shift around 7 a.m. and heard this rhythmic chunk, chunk, chunk coming from behind Carlson's overgrown hedges. Through the gaps between the branches, I could see him out there with a pickaxe and shovel, breaking through the frozen topsoil like a man possessed. But these weren't garden beds he was making. Each hole was precisely measured, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, dug down at least 4 feet deep before he'd start on the next one. Within a week, his entire backyard looked like a checkerboard of excavations, some filled back in with fresh dirt, others left gaping open like wounds in the earth. The strangest part was his schedule. Sometimes I'd hear him at midnight, sometimes at 4 p.m., sometimes during a snowstorm when any sane person would be inside watching TV. I tried talking to some of the other neighbors about it in early December. Mrs. Hoffman, who'd lived on the street for 40 years and knew everyone's family history back 3 generations, just pursed her lips and said Carlson had always been peculiar since his wife disappeared about 8 years back. Not died, disappeared. She'd supposedly run off with some insurance salesman from Toledo, but Mrs. Hoffman said it with this tone that suggested she didn't quite believe that story. The Andersons, the young couple with twin toddlers who lived directly next to Carlson, mentioned they'd called the cops once because the digging was keeping their kids awake. but the officer just said there was no law against landscaping your own property at odd hours. They'd started running a white noise machine in the twins' room and invested in blackout curtains so the motion sensor light Carlson had installed wouldn't wake them every time he went out there with his shovel. By mid-December, things got weirder. I was walking my beagle, Rufus, past Carlson's house one evening around 6 p.m. when I saw him hauling something to one of the holes. These long, heavy bags of what he claimed was fertilizer when he caught me looking. But fertilizer in December? In Michigan? And the bags didn't look right. They were these unmarked black plastic things, maybe 5 feet long, that he'd drag across the frozen grass, leaving deep grooves in the frost. He'd lower them carefully into the holes with this elaborate pulley system he'd rigged up, like they were fragile or important somehow. When he saw me watching, he didn't say anything, just gave me this long, empty stare that made Rufus start whimpering and pulling at his leash to get away. After that, I started taking a different route for our walks, but I could still hear that shovel hitting dirt at all hours, a metallic heartbeat that seemed to pulse through the whole neighborhood. The thing that really made me start documenting everything was when I noticed the pattern. I worked Christmas Eve night, and when I got home Christmas morning, exhausted and ready to sleep through the holiday, I went up to my bedroom, which had a partial view over Carlson's hedge. From that angle, with the winter sun hitting just right and snow covering everything except the disturbed earth, I could finally see the full layout of his backyard. The holes weren't random at all. They formed a perfect grid, 7 rows of 28 rectangular excavations total. Some had been filled in completely and had these small wooden stakes marking them. Others were partially filled, and about 6 were still empty, waiting. But waiting for what? I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures, zooming in as much as I could. That's when I noticed something else. Each filled hole had a date carved into its wooden marker, going back about 3 months, but the dates weren't sequential. They jumped around, November 3rd next to December 15th next to November 27th, like he was following some calendar, only he understood. I couldn't stop thinking about those dates over the next few days. I even started keeping a notebook, writing down when I heard him digging, trying to match it with the dates on those markers. Then on December 28th, around 11 p.m., the pattern broke completely. Instead of the steady rhythm of digging I'd gotten used to, there was this frantic quality to it, like he was racing against time. I looked out my window and could see his motion sensor light going crazy, flickering on and off as he moved rapidly between holes. He wasn't digging new ones, he was opening up the filled ones, throwing dirt everywhere with this desperate energy I'd never seen from him before. The next morning, I saw him out there with a garden hose, even though it was about 20 degrees outside, spraying water into each reopened hole while muttering something I couldn't make out. His clothes were filthy, his gray hair wild, and his hands were bleeding from where the frozen dirt had torn through his work gloves. That's when I decided to call the police myself. Not about noise or disturbing the peace, but because something was genuinely wrong here. The dispatcher sounded bored until I mentioned the bloody hands and the 28 holes in a perfect grid. Then she said she'd send someone out to do a welfare check. About an hour later, I watched from my kitchen window as a single patrol car pulled up. The officer, this young guy who looked fresh out of the academy, walked up to Carlson's door and knocked. They talked for maybe 5 minutes on the porch. I could see Carlson gesturing wildly, pointing toward his backyard, and the officer nodding along. Then, to my complete disbelief, the cop just left. I caught him before he drove away and asked what was going on. He said Mr. Carlson explained he was installing an elaborate drainage system for a greenhouse he was planning to build in the spring. Showed him receipts for PVC pipe and everything. The dates on the stakes were supposedly when different sections needed to be completed, according to some farming almanac. The officer looked at me like I was the crazy one for being concerned, but I knew something was wrong when I heard Carlson on the phone that night. My bedroom window was cracked open despite the cold because my radiator was acting up, making the room too hot. Around 2 a.m., I heard his voice carrying across the frozen air from his backyard. Not the words exactly, but the tone. He was pleading with someone, this desperate, broken voice I'd never heard from him before. Then silence for a long time, followed by what sounded like sobbing. The next sound was the shovel again, but slower this time, deliberate. Through my window, I could see him working by flashlight now, his motion sensor light turned off, filling in all the holes one by one with this methodical precision. He worked straight through until dawn, and when he was finished, his backyard looked almost normal, just freshly turned earth in neat rectangular patches, like graves in a cemetery that hadn't gotten their headstones yet. For 3 days, nothing happened. No digging, no lights, no movement from Carlson's house at all. His mail started piling up, and his driveway remained unshoveled after a light snowfall on New Year's Eve. I thought maybe he'd finally exhausted himself, or maybe he was sick from being outside in the cold for so long. The Andersons mentioned they hadn't seen him either, and even Mrs. Hoffman seemed concerned, which was unusual for her. She kept peering through her curtains at his house, clutching her phone like she was debating whether to call someone. On January 2nd, I was getting ready for a night shift when I noticed a van parked in Carlson's driveway. Plain white, no company logos, with tinted windows. 2 men in dark coveralls were walking around his backyard with some kind of equipment that looked like metal detectors, sweeping them slowly over each filled hole. They spent about an hour out there, occasionally stopping to plant little orange flags in the ground, marking specific spots in that grid of disturbed earth. The sirens came that evening, right as I was leaving for work. Not just 1 or 2 patrol cars, but the whole circus. Multiple police vehicles, an ambulance, crime scene van, even the coroner's truck. They blocked off the entire street. Yellow tape everywhere, uniforms going in and out of Carlson's house with evidence bags and cameras. I had to show my hospital ID just to get my car out of my own driveway. By the time I got home the next morning, they'd set up these white tents over Carlson's entire backyard, the kind you see on crime shows when they're trying to preserve evidence from the weather. Neighbors were clustered in small groups along the street, whispering and pointing, everyone suddenly having a story about how they'd always known something was off about him. Mrs. Hoffman told me they'd found Carlson in his basement, claimed he'd had a heart attack, but the way she said it, glancing around nervously, I knew she'd heard something else, something worse. The truth came out in pieces over the next few weeks, mostly through a cousin who worked dispatch and the local newspaper that finally got hold of the police report. Carlson hadn't been burying bodies, he'd been digging them up. Turns out his wife never ran off with any insurance salesman. She'd been under the concrete floor of his basement for 8 years, and when the foundation started cracking last fall, he panicked. He'd been moving her remains piece by piece, trying to spread them across those 28 holes, thinking if he distributed everything far enough apart, no one would ever be able to prove anything if the basement was ever excavated. The phone call I'd heard that night was to his brother in Colorado, confessing everything, saying the guilt was eating him alive. The brother had called the FBI, and those men with the metal detectors were federal agents using ground-penetrating radar to map out exactly where he'd put everything. The medical examiner said Carlson had ingested enough sleeping pills to kill 3 people, washing them down with antifreeze he'd bought at the auto parts store, probably right after filling in those holes for the last time. They spent 2 weeks excavating that backyard, sifting through every cubic inch of dirt in those 28 holes. I had to stay at a motel because they needed access to my property line, and the smell. God, the smell once they started finding things. Not just remains, but jewelry, pieces of clothing. Even her wedding ring still on a finger bone they found in hole number 17. The Anderson family moved out before the investigation was even finished. Said they couldn't stand knowing what had been happening just over their fence while their babies played in the yard. Mrs. Hoffman had a stroke a month later, though the doctors said it wasn't related. The house stood empty for 3 years before they finally tore it down, and even now, that lot remains vacant. Sometimes when I drive past it on my way to visit my daughter in Detroit, I can still see the outline of those holes in the grass, 28 perfect rectangles that refuse to blend in no matter how many times they reseed the lawn, like the earth itself remembers what was hidden there and won't let anyone forget. "7 months ago, I moved into what seemed like the perfect rental house in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Phoenix. I was 32, had just landed a promotion at the accounting firm where I worked, and finally had enough saved to live somewhere with an actual yard instead of another cramped apartment. The house was nothing fancy, a modest 2-bedroom with faded yellow siding and a single-car garage, but it represented everything I'd been working toward. My first week there, I remember thinking how lucky I was to find such a peaceful street, lined with mesquite trees and houses that looked like they'd been there since the 80s. Most of my neighbors were older couples who kept to themselves, exactly what I wanted after years of thin apartment walls. The only exception was the house directly next to mine, where a guy named Travis lived with what seemed like a rotating cast of roommates. Travis was probably in his late 20s, drove a beat-up Ford F-150 with those aftermarket LED headlights that could blind you from a mile away, and had this habit of hosting parties every Thursday through Saturday night. At first, I tried to be understanding. We'd all been young once, right? But these weren't just regular get-togethers. The bass from his sound system would rattle my windows until 3 or 4 in the morning, and his backyard would fill with dozens of people shouting over the music, their voices carrying straight into my bedroom. I'd bought a white noise machine, then upgraded to heavy-duty earplugs, even rearranged my whole bedroom so my bed was as far from his property as possible. Nothing worked. After 6 weeks of barely sleeping 3 nights a week, stumbling through client meetings with bags under my eyes, I finally did what I'd been avoiding. I called in a noise complaint to the non-emergency police line. The Monday after I made that call, everything changed. I was getting ready for work around 7 a.m. when I noticed Travis's truck idling at the end of his driveway, exhaust fumes drifting in the cool morning air. Strange thing was, he was just sitting there, not looking at his phone or anything, just staring straight ahead through his windshield. I didn't think much of it until I backed out of my garage and started down the street. In my rearview mirror, I watched his truck pull out and fall in behind me, keeping about 3 car lengths back. We both turned left onto Cedar Road, then right onto the main boulevard. By the time I merged onto the I-10, he was still there, maintaining that same exact distance. My office was a good 25 minutes away, and Travis followed me for 20 of those minutes before suddenly taking an exit about 5 miles from my workplace. The next morning, same thing. His truck waiting, him following, keeping that precise distance like he'd measured it out. Wednesday morning, I decided to test it. Instead of my usual route, I took a completely unnecessary detour through a residential area, making random turns through streets I'd never driven before. There he was, that faded red F-150 with the dented rear bumper, turning when I turned, stopping when I stopped at signs. At one point, I pulled into a gas station I didn't need, just to see what he'd do. He drove past, but when I came back out and continued toward work, there he was again, waiting at the next intersection like he knew exactly where I'd be. That's when I found the first note. I came home that evening to find a piece of paper tucked under my front door. Not mailed, not in an envelope, just a folded sheet of computer paper. The message was typed in all caps. Mind your own business next time. Neighbors should stick together, not call cops on each other. You made your choice. The notes kept coming, each one more unhinged than the last. Thursday's was shoved through the mail slot while I was eating dinner. I actually heard it slide through and hit the floor. This one had a photo printed on regular paper, grainy and dark, but I could make out my own car in my driveway, taken from what must have been Travis's property line. Below the photo, sleep tight knowing you ruined a good thing. Cops won't always be around. Friday's note appeared on my windshield when I came out for work, held down by the wiper blade. Just one line this time. I know your schedule better than you do. I started parking in the garage after that. keeping the door locked even during the day, checking my mirrors constantly during my commute. I'd catch glimpses of his truck at different times, sometimes behind me, sometimes parked across from my office building, sometimes just driving past my house slowly at odd hours. I installed a Ring doorbell, started documenting everything, taking photos of the notes, screenshots of the camera footage showing his truck creeping by at 2 a.m., 3:47 a.m., 5:15 a.m. I went to the police station that Saturday with everything I'd collected. The officer who took my report, a tired-looking woman named Officer Brennan, listened to my story while clicking through the photos on my phone. She told me what I'd already figured out. The notes were concerning, but not explicitly threatening enough for immediate action. The following could be coincidental since we lived on the same street. And without proof Travis was the one leaving the notes, their hands were tied. She said they'd increase patrols in the area and suggested I file for a restraining order on Monday. The forms she gave me felt pathetically thin in my hands. That night, Travis threw another party, the music louder than ever, like he knew about my visit to the station. I lay in bed with my phone in my hand, wondering if I should call in another complaint, but something told me that would only make things worse. Around 1 a.m., during a brief lull in the music, I heard footsteps on my front porch, slow and deliberate, followed by what sounded like someone trying my doorknob. Sunday was quiet. Too quiet. No truck following me to the grocery store. No notes, no late-night drive-bys. Travis's house looked empty. His truck gone all day. I almost let myself relax. Spent the afternoon doing laundry and meal prepping for the week, trying to pretend everything was normal. But that evening, while I was taking out the trash, I saw something that made my whole body go rigid. There was a spare key to my house that I kept hidden under a fake rock near the back gate, the kind you buy at Home Depot that's supposed to blend in with real rocks. The fake rock was sitting on top of my garbage can lid, placed there deliberately, and when I picked it up with trembling fingers, the compartment was empty. The key was gone. I ran back inside, slammed the door behind me, and called a locksmith for an emergency rekey, not caring that Sunday rates would cost me $300. While I waited for them to arrive, I wedged a chair under the front doorknob and pushed my couch against the back door. The locksmith finished around 9 p.m. and I felt marginally safer with new keys in my pocket. I even managed to fall asleep around midnight, exhausted from the stress of the past week. Then at 2:47 a.m., I remember the exact time because I stared at my phone screen in disbelief. I woke up to the sound of my garage door opening, not breaking, not being forced, opening smoothly with the automatic opener, like someone had the remote. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd started keeping beside my bed and crept toward the door that led from my kitchen to the garage. Through the window, I could see the garage door was fully up, the space empty except for my car, the street beyond dark and silent. Then headlights flooded the space as Travis's truck pulled straight into my garage, parking beside my car like he belonged there. He got out slowly, casually, wearing dark jeans and a black hoodie despite the warm night. He wasn't rushing, wasn't trying to hide. He stood there in my garage looking directly at the window where I was watching and gave a small wave with his fingers. I called 911 while backing away from the window, whispering frantically to the dispatcher that someone had broken into my garage and was just standing there. Travis must have heard me on the phone because he started walking toward the door that connected the garage to my kitchen, the same door I was standing behind. He didn't try the handle, didn't knock, just stood on the other side, maybe 2 feet away from me with only that hollow door between us. Then he started talking, his voice calm and conversational, loud enough to carry through. "You know, I grew up in this house. My parents owned it for 30 years before they sold it. I helped my dad install that garage door opener when I was 16. Still remember the code, 1988, his birth year. Funny how new owners never think to change those things." He paused and I could hear him shifting his weight, the concrete creaking under his boots. "The parties were never about the music, man. It was about respect. This whole street, we look out for each other. But you went straight to the cops. Didn't even try to talk to me first. The dispatcher kept asking me questions, but I could barely focus. Just kept repeating the address and begging them to hurry. Travis continued, his tone getting harder. I've been really patient with you. Following you to work? That was just me showing you I could. The notes? Just trying to communicate since you clearly don't like face-to-face conversation. But breaking into my old house to stand in my old garage? That's me being nice. Because what I really want to do is open this door and explain things properly. I heard him try the handle then. Locked, thankfully. And he let out this disappointed sigh. You changed the locks today. Smart. But you didn't change the garage code, did you? And you know what else you didn't think about? Your car is right here next to mine. Would be a real shame if something happened to it while we wait for your cop friends. I heard something metal scraping against metal. Keys against my car door, maybe. And that's when I saw the patrol car lights through my front window, red and blue washing across my living room walls. Travis heard the sirens too. Through the door, I heard him chuckle, this low sound that made my stomach twist into knots. Guess that's my cue, he said, like we'd been having a normal conversation. But hey, we're neighbors, right? I'm not going anywhere. You're not going anywhere. We'll have plenty of time to sort this out. I heard his footsteps moving away from the door, unhurried, and then the sound of his truck door opening. The police pulled up just as he was backing out of my garage, and I watched through my front window as they stopped him in the driveway. 2 officers got out, flashlights in hand, and Travis rolled down his window, gesturing casually as he talked. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but after about 10 minutes they let him walk back to his house. Just like that. One of the officers, a young guy who looked fresh out of the academy, came to my door and explained that Travis claimed I'd given him permission to park in my garage because his driveway was full from the party guests earlier. Since there was no sign of forced entry and Travis had left willingly when asked, they couldn't arrest him. The officer took my statement, documented the scratches on my car door, deep grooves that spelled out "mind your own" before apparently being interrupted, and said a detective would follow up in the morning. After they left, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with every light on, baseball bat across my lap, watching through the windows. Around 5 a.m., I saw Travis's front door open. He walked to the edge of his property, coffee mug in hand, and just stood there looking at my house. We made eye contact through my living room window, and he raised his mug like he was toasting me. That was 3 days ago. I've been staying at a motel since then, only coming back during the day when there are witnesses around. The detective says they're building a case, that the scratches on my car are enough for vandalism charges at least. Travis's parties have stopped, but every time I drive by to check my mail or grab more clothes, his truck is in the driveway, and he's always somewhere visible, washing his car, sitting on his porch, trimming his hedges, always watching, always waiting. The lease on my house has 8 more months, and breaking it would cost me thousands I don't have. So for now, we're at this horrible stalemate. 2 neighbors locked in a silent war that I never wanted, all because I just wanted to sleep through the night. The rental house on Ashwood Drive came with warnings we chose to ignore, because the price was too good to pass up. 5 college students splitting $800 a month meant we could actually afford groceries and textbooks that semester, which mattered more to us than Frank the landlord's nervous comments about colorful neighbors, while he jingled his keys and avoided eye contact. Nathan and I took the upstairs bedroom with the cracked window that overlooked both yards, while Jessica and her cousin Megan grabbed the 2 downstairs rooms, and Colby set up in what used to be a dining room. We were all around 21, that age where you think you can handle anything because you've survived a few years away from home and figured out how to do your own taxes. The house itself was nothing special: faded yellow siding, a fence held together by rust and wishful thinking, and kitchen cabinets that didn't quite close all the way. But it was ours for the year, and we spent that first afternoon hauling in secondhand furniture and making plans for dinner parties, study groups, All the things you imagine when you're young and signing your first real lease. The duplex next door looked like our house's evil twin. Same structure. But where we had Jessica's attempt at a flower garden and string lights Nathan hung crooked across the porch, they had broken glass ground into the dirt and aluminum foil covering every window. 4 men lived there, each one carrying that hollow-cheeked, jumpy energy of long-term meth users. Their ages hard to pin down, but probably between 35 and 50. The chemical smell hit you before you even saw them. This acidic burn that made your nose itch and your eyes water if the wind blew wrong. Their fights were legendary among the other student rentals on our block. Volcanic screaming matches at 3 a.m. that ended with someone getting thrown into the fence or car windows, getting smashed with crowbars. But the tall one with the shaved head was different from the others. While they'd scream and throw punches at each other, he'd stand perfectly still on their porch, smoking cigarette after cigarette, these prison tattoos crawling up his neck like black veins. His eyes were this washed-out gray, like dirty ice, and whenever I walked from my car to the front door, he'd track my movement without turning his head, just his eyes following me until I disappeared inside. Everything changed on a Thursday night in early September, when their usual screaming match turned into something else entirely. Nathan and I were upstairs studying for midterms. Jessica was at her restaurant job, and Megan and Colby were watching something on Netflix when we heard the crash. Not the usual bottle throwing or door slamming, but the sound of a human body hitting our fence hard enough to crack the posts. Through our bedroom window, I saw 2 of them beating the third one with what looked like pieces of rebar. Real methodical hits to his ribs and legs while he curled up in the dirt trying to protect his head. The tall one with the gray eyes just stood there watching, lighting another cigarette with steady hands while his roommate got destroyed 10 feet away. Nathan was already on the phone with 911, but I couldn't look away from the tall one's face. He was smiling this small, satisfied smile, like he was watching his favorite TV show. When the cops finally showed up 15 minutes later, the beaten guy was unconscious, blood pooling under his face, and they had to call an ambulance. The other 3 stood there lying through their teeth, claiming he fell down the stairs, and somehow the cops bought it or just didn't care enough to push it. After that night, the tall one started paying attention to me in a way that made my skin prickle with warning. He learned my schedule somehow. He'd be sitting on their porch when I left for my morning classes at 8:30, still there when I got back around 2. Always in the same plastic chair with its broken armrest, always smoking and staring. He started showing up at the grocery store where I shopped, never with a cart or basket, just wandering the aisles until he found me, then staying exactly 2 aisles over, close enough that I could feel him watching through the gaps in the shelves. Once I tested it, doubling back through the cereal aisle 3 times, and each time he adjusted his position to keep me in sight. The campus coffee shop where I studied Tuesday afternoons. Suddenly he was there too, sitting in the corner with nothing but a water cup, those gray eyes locked on me over my laptop screen. Nathan wanted to confront him, but I begged him not to, remembering that smile while his friend bled into the dirt, knowing that provoking someone like that would only make things worse. The stalking escalated the following week when I found him standing directly outside our front door at 11 p.m., just standing there in the dark, not knocking or trying the handle, just breathing loud enough that I could hear it through the wood. I'd gone downstairs to get water and saw his shadow through the frosted glass panel, this tall, dark shape that wasn't moving at all. My phone was upstairs, Nathan was asleep, and I stood there in our hallway for 20 minutes, barefoot on the cold hardwood, watching that shadow and praying he'd leave. When Jessica's key finally rattled in the lock from the other side, he stepped back into the darkness so fast she didn't even see him, just walked in complaining about her shift while I stood there shaking, trying to explain what had just happened. The next morning we found cigarette butts arranged in a perfect circle on our doormat, all the same brand he smoked, each one crushed in the exact same way. Nathan called the cops, but they said standing on a porch wasn't illegal, and without proof of threats or trespassing, there was nothing they could do. The officer, this tired-looking woman who'd probably dealt with our neighbors before, just shrugged and suggested we get better locks and maybe some cameras if we were really worried. That Friday, things got worse when Nathan and I came home from a late movie to find the tall one sitting on our porch steps, not his own. He was carving something into the wooden railing with a pocket knife. These deep gouges that turned out to be my initials when we looked closer later. Nathan lost it, told him to get the hell off our property, his voice cracking between anger and fear, while I stood behind him gripping his arm hard enough to leave marks. The tall one stood up real slow, unfolding himself like some kind of insect, until he towered over both of us. He must have been 6'4" at least, with arms covered in those homemade tattoos that looked like infection waiting to happen. He leaned in close enough that I could smell him, cigarettes, something chemical, and this underlying stench like meat starting to turn, and said my name, just my first name, in this whisper that sounded like he'd been practicing it. Then he walked back to his place without another word, but stopped at the property line to look back and blow me a kiss. Nathan called 911 again, and this time they sent 2 officers who took a report and pictures of the carved initials, but said since he left when asked it was just misdemeanor vandalism at worst. We started taking precautions after that. Nathan walked me to and from my car every single time. We installed a doorbell camera with our pooled tip money from Jessica's restaurant job, and Colby started sleeping on the couch downstairs with that baseball bat within reach. For 3 days, we didn't see the tall one at all, and I started to think maybe the police visit had scared him off. But on Monday night around 2 a.m., I woke up to Nathan squeezing my shoulder, his whole body rigid beside me in bed. Through our cracked window came voices from below, not yelling this time, but low conversation, and the unmistakable sound of our back gate's latch being worked. The gate had a padlock, but we could hear metal scraping against metal, testing, prying. Nathan already had his phone out calling 911 while I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. There were 3 figures in our backyard, the tall one and 2 of his roommates, all of them moving with that twitchy meth energy, but trying to be quiet about it. One had bolt cutters. Another was carrying something wrapped in a towel that had the weight and shape of a crowbar or worse. They got through the padlock in less than a minute, and then they were in our backyard proper, moving toward the house with purpose. The tall one went straight for the spot under our bedroom window, looking up like he knew exactly which room was mine, while the other 2 spread out to check the back door and the windows of the ground floor bedrooms where Jessica and Megan were sleeping. I could hear my heartbeat in my throat as the tall one reached up and actually touched our window screen, running his fingers along the mesh like he was testing how hard it would be to cut through. Nathan was whispering frantically to the 911 operator, giving our address saying they were actively trying to break in. Please hurry. Please send someone now. Through the phone, I could hear the dispatcher saying, units were on the way, stay inside, stay on the line. But those minutes stretched out like hours. The one at the back door had started working on the lock with something metal, the scratching sound carrying up through the walls, while the tall one pulled out what looked like a box cutter and started sawing at our screen, these deliberate strokes that sent the mesh curling inward toward us. Just when the screen gave way with this sick tearing sound and his hand started reaching through, sirens exploded into the distance, not close yet, but close enough. The change in the 3 men was instant, like roaches when you flip on a light. The tall one yanked his arm back so fast he left skin on the torn mesh, and all 3 of them bolted toward the back gate. But in their panic, one of them, the shorter guy with the face tattoos, tripped over Jessica's garden hose and went down hard, the towel-wrapped object flying from his hands and landing with a heavy thud in the grass. They didn't stop for him or the weapon, just kept running, vanishing through the gate into the alley behind our house. The sirens got louder, closer, and then there were red and blue lights flooding our backyard, cops with flashlights drawn running the same path the intruders had taken. Nathan and I stayed locked in our room, holding each other and shaking, while we heard the police radio chatter outside. 3 subjects fleeing westbound, requesting backup, need canine unit for track. Within 10 minutes, they'd caught all 3 of them trying to hide in a shed 2 blocks over. The cops brought them back in separate cars, and through our window, I watched the tall one in the backseat of a cruiser, his gray eyes finding mine even from that distance, even with his hands cuffed behind him. The police searched them and their duplex with a warrant that night, finding 2 knives, brass knuckles, and enough meth to put them away for serious time. The item dropped in our yard turned out to be a sawed-off piece of pipe, filed down at one end to a sharp edge. The detective who interviewed us the next morning, an older guy with kind eyes who kept calling me Han, said they'd found notebooks in the tall one's room. Pages and pages about me, my schedule, my license plate, descriptions of my clothes, detailed plans about what he wanted to do once he got me alone. Some of the pages had drawings that the detective wouldn't let me see, just said they were evidence of intent, and that we were lucky we'd called when we did. The tall one got 15 years, the meth possession, attempted breaking and entering, stalking charges, and apparently he was already on parole for something the detective wouldn't specify but implied was violent. His 2 buddies got 5 to 7 each. We had to testify at the preliminary hearing, and even from across the courtroom with guards between us, he never stopped staring at me, mouthing words I couldn't make out but knew weren't apologies. The prosecutor, this sharp woman in her 40s who didn't mess around, said his notebooks alone were enough to establish premeditation for whatever he'd been planning that night. She showed the jury photos of our carved-up window screen, the circle of cigarettes, my initials gouged into our porch, and apparently that was just the stuff they could show in court. We moved out 2 weeks after the trial, breaking our lease early, and Frank didn't even fight us on keeping the deposit. Turned out we weren't the first tenants to have problems with that duplex next door, just the first ones to survive long enough to press charges. Jessica found us a new place closer to campus, more expensive, but in a neighborhood full of families and retired professors who complained if your music was too loud after 9 p.m., which sounded like paradise after Ashwood Drive. 6 months later, I ran into the detective at a coffee shop downtown, and he recognized me immediately, asked how I was doing with this genuine concern that made me tear up right there by the espresso machine. He told me something that still makes my whole body go cold when I think about it. They'd found more notebooks hidden in the tall one's ceiling, older ones, with notes about other girls. 3 different women over 2 years, all college students, all living within a few blocks of that duplex. 2 had moved away suddenly, breaking leases just like we did, and 1 had been reported missing 6 months before we moved in, though they could never prove anything. The detective said the tall one wasn't talking, would probably never admit to anything, but the way he said it made me understand what he really meant. We got out just in time. Nathan and I are still together, living in a different state now, both graduated and working normal jobs, but I still check locks obsessively, still look for gray eyes in crowds, still wake up sometimes thinking I hear someone sawing through window screens. The detective gave me his card that day in the coffee shop, said to call if I ever needed anything, and I still carry it in my wallet like a talisman, proof that it really happened, that we really survived it, that those 3 a.m. sirens really did save my life. "4 inches doesn't sound like much until someone tries to steal them from your backyard. I was out there that morning in August 2016, watering my tomato plants, when I noticed Douglas Brenner standing at the edge of my property with a contractor and a pile of fence posts. They were setting markers and something was wrong. The line they were marking cut into my yard, past where the old chain-link fence had stood for 40 years. Oliver, my rescue beagle, was barking at them through the window, sensing trouble before I fully understood what was happening. I walked over, still holding the garden hose, water dripping onto my bare feet. Douglas didn't even acknowledge me at first, just kept pointing at spots for the contractor to mark, consulting this little notebook he always carried. When I asked what they were doing, he said, without looking up, that he was fixing a 40-year-old mistake, and that the property line had been wrong since before I was born. Those 4 inches of grass I'd been mowing for 2 years? According to him, they'd always been his. I should explain who Douglas was because nothing about this man was normal. Mid-50s, worked some kind of night security job that had him leaving at 10 p.m. sharp every night. He'd moved in about 6 months after I'd inherited my grandmother's house. And from the start, he was peculiar. Impossibly tall at 6'3". He had this way of walking where he'd lean forward like he was pushing through an invisible barrier. His hair was dyed this aggressive auburn color that looked like rust in the sunlight, always slicked back with enough gel to style 3 people. But the strangest thing was his measuring obsession. I'd catch him at all hours with a tape measure, checking distances between his driveway and the curb, from his mailbox to his front door, always writing numbers in that notebook. Once I saw him at dawn, literally measuring the height of his grass before mowing it. The man treated his property like it was a crime scene that needed constant documentation, and now he wanted 4 inches of mine. The argument started civil enough. I told him we needed to check the property records at City Hall before anyone built anything. He pulled out a folded survey map from his back pocket. Of course he had one ready, covered in pencil marks and calculations. His finger, which I noticed had a perfectly manicured nail, traced along a line that did indeed show the property boundary, cutting into what I'd always considered my yard. But here's the thing. My grandmother had lived in that house since 1976, and that chain-link fence had been there when she moved in. 40 years of established boundary had to count for something, right? I mentioned adverse possession, something I'd Googled on my phone while he was talking, and his face changed. Not dramatically, but his jaw tightened and this vein appeared on his temple, pulsing like a little worm under his skin. He folded the map very slowly, creasing each fold with his thumbnail, and said I had 24 hours to reconsider my position before he proceeded with the fence installation. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. I kept replaying how his voice had dropped when he said reconsider, how he'd smiled but only with his mouth while his eyes stayed flat and unblinking. Oliver was restless too, kept growling at the window that faced Douglas's house. Around midnight, I heard something outside and peeked through the blinds. Douglas was out there with a flashlight and his tape measure, walking the disputed line over and over, occasionally stopping to write in his notebook. He did this for 2 hours straight, just pacing and measuring. And at one point he stood at my bedroom window for a full minute, flashlight pointed down but clearly aware which room was mine. I called my friend Amy, asked if I was being paranoid. She said to document everything, maybe install a camera. I wish I'd listened to her sooner. The next morning, Wednesday, I went to City Hall right when they opened. The clerk who helped me, a woman named Dolores with cat-eye glasses and fingernails painted different colors, pulled up the property records on her ancient computer. The original plot maps from 1951 were unclear about the exact boundary. The measurements were in some old surveying system that nobody used anymore. But here's what Dolores found interesting. In 1976, when my grandmother bought the house, there was a surveyor's note mentioning the existing fence as the established boundary marker. She printed everything out for me, highlighting the relevant parts with a yellow marker that smelled like artificial lemons. I felt vindicated, had this whole speech planned for Douglas about respecting long-time boundaries and being a good neighbor. When I got home, his contractor was already there, post-hole digger running, and they'd started installing the fence exactly where Douglas wanted it. The 4 inches of my yard now had posts cemented into it. I marched over there with my papers, Oliver trailing behind me on his leash because I didn't trust him not to bite someone in my current mood. Douglas was standing by his garage, watching the work with his arms crossed. When I showed him the documents, he didn't even look at them. Just stared at me with this expression I can only describe as amused contempt, like I was a child showing him a crayon drawing. He said possession was 9/10 of the law, and unless I had $10,000 for a proper survey and legal fees, I should accept reality. Then he said something that made my scalp prickle. Your grandmother was smarter than you. She knew when to leave things alone. The way he said it, the implication that he'd had this same dispute with her, made me realize this wasn't really about 4 inches of grass. Oliver started barking frantically, pulling at his leash, and Douglas just watched us with that same flat stare until I retreated back to my house. Thursday morning, I woke up to a flat tire. Not just low on air, completely shredded, like someone had taken a knife to it multiple times. The sidewall was ribboned, rubber hanging in strips. I knew it was him, but of course I couldn't prove anything. The security camera I'd ordered wouldn't arrive until Monday. I called in sick to work, got the tire replaced at a shop downtown. The mechanic, a kid maybe 20 years old with gauge earrings and grease under his fingernails, asked if I'd pissed someone off because this was deliberate damage, no question. Cost me $200 I didn't really have. When I got home, the fence was completely installed, and Douglas had already hung a no trespassing sign on his side, facing my yard. But that wasn't the worst part. Oliver was in my front yard, running loose, my back gate wide open. He never left the backyard on his own. Someone had deliberately let him out. I found him sniffing around Mrs. Garrison's petunias, thankfully unharmed, but the message was clear. Friday was quiet, almost worse than if something had happened. I worked my full shift, came home to find everything seemingly normal. Douglas's car was gone, his night shift. I stood at my kitchen window looking at that new fence, at those stolen 4 inches of yard, and felt this rage building in my chest. Around 8 p.m., I grabbed a measuring tape from my grandmother's old toolbox and went outside. I wanted to document exactly how far into my property he'd built. As I was crouched down, measuring from the old fence line mark still visible in the grass, I heard breathing behind me. Heavy, deliberate breathing. Douglas was standing 3 feet away, dressed in his security uniform. Black pants, black shirt with some company logo I couldn't make out in the dim light. He must have doubled back after leaving. "Measuring won't change anything," he said, his voice so calm it raised goosebumps on my arms. "But if it makes you feel better, go ahead. I'll wait." And he did. Stood there for 20 minutes while I pretended to take measurements, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the tape steady. Saturday morning brought a new development. I woke up around 7 to Oliver going absolutely insane, barking and scratching at the back door. Through the kitchen window, I saw Douglas in my backyard, not his newly claimed strip, but deep in my actual yard, near my tomato plants. He was on his knees with that notebook, sketching something, occasionally standing up to take photos with a digital camera that looked like it belonged in a museum. When I yanked open the door to confront him, he calmly stood up and walked toward me, not hurrying, not acknowledging he'd done anything wrong. "Your eastern boundary is also incorrect," he announced, like he was telling me the weather. "The previous owners of my house let your grandmother encroach there too. 3 feet, possibly 3.5. He held up his notebook, showing me incomprehensible diagrams and numbers. "I'm being generous, only taking back the 4 inches on the north side, for now." The way he said, "for now," made my knees weak. This wasn't going to end with the fence. The real escalation happened Saturday night. I'd called the police earlier about the trespassing, but they said without proof of damage or threat, it was a civil matter. The officer who came by, a tired-looking woman named Officer Reeves, basically told me to get a lawyer. Around 11 p.m., I was getting ready for bed when Oliver started growling at the front door. Through the peephole, I saw Douglas standing on my porch. Not knocking, not moving, just standing there facing my door with his hands clasped behind his back. I didn't open it, obviously. Called 911, but by the time they arrived 15 minutes later, he was gone. Officer Reeves came back, looked annoyed, suggested maybe I was overreacting to a neighbor dispute. But then we found what he'd left. A manila envelope tucked into my screen door. Inside were dozens of photos of my house, some dating back years. My grandmother working in the garden, her at the mailbox, even some through windows showing her watching TV. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note. "She understood the importance of boundaries. You need to learn." Sunday was when I decided to fight back, but not how you'd think. I spent the morning at my grandmother's old desk, going through her papers, looking for anything about Douglas. Found it in a notebook from 2014, her shaky handwriting describing the strange man next door who watches through the fence. She documented dates and times, just like he did with his measurements. One entry made me nauseous. He comes into the yard when I'm at church. Leaves things moved just enough so I know he was here. Police won't help. Installed better locks today. My grandmother had been dealing with this for 2 years before she died, and never told anyone. I called Amy, asked her to come over, didn't want to be alone anymore. She arrived around 2 p.m. with her husband Carl, a contractor who took one look at the fence situation, and said Douglas had actually done a sloppy job. The posts weren't properly set. The whole thing could be legally challenged as unsafe construction. We were discussing options when Douglas appeared at the new fence, just materialized there like he'd been waiting. "You have visitors," he said to me, ignoring Amy and Carl completely. "That's nice, but they'll leave eventually. Everyone does. And then it's just you and me again, discussing what's mine." That evening, after Amy and Carl left despite my begging them to stay, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this, walking on eggshells, waiting for the next escalation. I found a locksmith who did emergency calls. Had him come out and change every lock on the house, install deadbolts, secure the windows. Cost me $800 on credit cards I'd been trying to pay down. While the locksmith worked, I saw Douglas watching from his kitchen window, that notebook in his hand, writing constantly. Around 9 p.m., just as the locksmith was leaving, Douglas knocked on my door. Not the aggressive standing from before, but a polite, normal knock. Against every instinct, I answered it, keeping the chain on. He was holding a pie. An actual pie, like something from a sitcom, steam still rising from the crust. "Apple," he said, his face arranged in what he probably thought was a friendly expression. "To apologize for any misunderstanding. Your grandmother loved my pies. She gave me her key once so I could leave them inside when she wasn't home. I still have it actually, the key, but I suppose it won't work anymore, will it?" He smiled then, all teeth, and I slammed the door so hard the walls shook. Monday morning I woke up to find Oliver in my bedroom, which was weird because I'd left him downstairs. The back door was still locked, deadbolt in place, but the door frame was slightly splintered, like someone had tried to force it but stopped. On my kitchen table was a survey map, not a copy, but an original from 1951, with new red lines drawn all over it. Every red line cut into my property, not just the 4 inches, but claiming nearly 6 feet on the east side, 3 feet on the south. A yellow sticky note was attached. "Original boundaries, happy to discuss timeline for corrections. DB." My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my coffee mug, ceramic exploding across the floor. Oliver wouldn't stop whimpering, pawing at the front door to get out. That's when I saw it through the window. Douglas had installed surveyor's stakes throughout my yard during the night, orange flags marking his imaginary new territory. But the moment that broke me was finding my grandmother's garden completely destroyed. Every tomato plant ripped from the ground and laid in a perfect line along what he claimed was the real boundary. I called the police again, and this time got a different officer, a younger guy named Daniels who actually took me seriously. He looked at the splintered door frame, the photos Douglas had left earlier, my grandmother's journal entries. Turned out Douglas Brenner had a history. Not violence exactly, but property disputes at 3 previous addresses, always with single women, always escalating until they moved. Officer Daniels helped me file for an emergency restraining order, walked me through the process, even gave me his direct number. The court date was set for Thursday. I spent Monday through Wednesday at Amy's house with Oliver, only going home with Carl to grab clothes and essentials. But Douglas must have been watching, because each time we went there was something new. More stakes, new red lines spray painted on my driveway, and once, all my mail spread across the porch in a perfect grid pattern, each piece exactly 2 inches apart. Thursday's court hearing was surreal. Douglas showed up in a suit that looked like it hadn't been worn in years, too tight in the shoulders, pants an inch too short. He'd brought a briefcase full of his documentation, hundreds of pages of measurements, photos, maps, all in clear plastic sleeves with typed labels. When he spoke to the judge, his voice was different, higher pitched, almost childlike, explaining how he was just trying to restore proper order to the neighborhood. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Harrison, looked through his papers for maybe 30 seconds before granting the restraining order. Douglas couldn't come within 100 feet of me or my property, had to remove all his stakes and markers, and the fence issue would be handled in civil court. When the judge read the decision, Douglas's face didn't change, but his left eye started twitching, this rapid flutter that made him look like he was winking repeatedly. He packed up his briefcase methodically, each paper returned to its exact place, then stood up and stared at me for a full 10 seconds before Officer Daniels told him to move along. The next 3 days were peaceful. Douglas's stakes disappeared. The fence remained, but I'd deal with that legally, and I actually slept through the night. Sunday evening, I was back home feeling almost normal, when Oliver started barking at the back door again. Douglas wasn't there. He couldn't be, not without violating the order. But lined up along the fence on his side were dozens of garden gnomes, all facing my house. Each one had a tiny notebook glued to its hands and miniature measuring tapes attached to their belts. In the center was a larger gnome with auburn hair painted on, obviously meant to be him. I called Officer Daniels, who came by and took photos, but said technically it wasn't a violation. The gnomes were on his property. That night I made my decision. Monday morning I called a realtor. The house sold in 3 weeks under market value, but I didn't care. The new owners were a young family with 3 kids, the kind of chaos Douglas wouldn't be able to intimidate. Before I left, I drove by one last time and saw him in his yard, measuring the distance between each gnome with his tape measure, adjusting them by millimeters. The new owners lasted 6 months before they had him arrested for trespassing. He's in jail now, Amy told me. Not for the harassment, but for violating his probation from a previous stalking charge in another state. I still have dreams about those 4 inches of grass, about finding him standing in my kitchen with his notebook, measuring the distance between my fear and his obsession. My name's Daniel, and at the time all this went down, I'd been living in a quiet cul-de-sac for about 3 years. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it had the kind of routine comfort that makes you forget the world outside can be chaotic. I worked from home most days, spent weekends grilling with a couple of neighbors, and usually ended my evenings on the porch with a cold beer. That sense of calm started to erode the moment one particular homeowner, a guy named Richard, decided to make himself the self-appointed enforcer of our block. From the start, he rubbed everyone the wrong way, but none of us could have guessed just how bad things would get. Richard had this big red pickup he treated like it was an extension of his personality, always parked sideways across someone's driveway or blocking part of the street. If you asked him to move it, he'd respond with a smirk or some nonsense about neighborhood codes that he seemed to invent on the spot. He once told me my trash cans were facing the wrong direction and claimed he'd report me for it. At first, I laughed it off. We all did. But the small harassments added up. Bogus complaints about lawns, fake rules about hedges, even telling kids where they could and couldn't ride their bikes. It felt less like eccentric behavior and more like he enjoyed pushing boundaries just to remind us he could. The first time I noticed something was seriously wrong was when his wife, Ellen, started showing up outside more often. She was polite, never said much, and had this way of avoiding eye contact whenever Richard was nearby. One afternoon while walking my dog, I saw her tugging on a sleeve to hide dark marks along her arm. Later, I spotted faint bruises around her jawline. When a neighbor gently asked if she was all right, Ellen forced a quick, "I'm fine," and slipped back inside. The unspoken agreement among us was clear. We were worried for her, but confronting Richard felt like walking into a storm. Things escalated on a humid evening when Richard stormed out of his house because the kids next door were playing tag in their yard. He started yelling about disrespect and noise violations while pointing at one of the boys, maybe 10 years old. What froze everyone in place was when he went back to his truck and pulled out a handgun, waving it around as if to punctuate his threats. Parents screamed, kids scattered, and the entire block went silent except for his ranting. That was the moment we all knew this wasn't just a difficult neighbor situation anymore. It was a powder keg waiting to blow. That night shook everyone. A couple of us tried calling the police, but when officers finally showed up, Richard was calm again, leaning against his truck like nothing happened. He spun some story about feeling threatened by aggressive kids, and since no one was physically harmed, they left with nothing more than a warning. The disbelief on the parents' faces said it all. How could waving a gun at children not count as immediate danger? From then on, every neighbor knew we couldn't rely on quick intervention. It was like Richard had found the perfect loophole in the system. The strange part was how Richard seemed to feed off the fear. The day after the incident, he walked down the street whistling, slow and deliberate, like he was reminding everyone he wasn't going anywhere. Ellen trailed behind him, clutching a grocery bag so tightly her knuckles looked pale. She wouldn't look at anyone. It gave me this gnawing feeling that she carried secrets we weren't ready to hear, or maybe ones she wasn't allowed to say out loud. Still, her silence made the situation heavier than his threats, because silence has a way of confirming the worst. We started holding quiet discussions in each other's living rooms after dark. No official meetings, just neighbors sitting on couches with cups of coffee, trading stories of every bizarre encounter. One family kept a log of every time Richard parked across their driveway. Another couple admitted he'd threatened to report them for trimming a tree. The more we compared notes, the clearer it became. His behavior wasn't random, it was systematic. He wanted control, and if he couldn't get it through intimidation, he'd get it through paperwork and fabricated rules. Eventually, someone suggested we start documenting everything together. Photos of his truck blocking driveways, recordings of his shouting, written logs with times and dates. It felt sneaky, like we were planning some underground resistance against a dictator. But the alternative was waiting until he did something irreversible. There was this undercurrent of dread at every gathering. What if the next blow-up wasn't just yelling or waving a gun, but an actual shot fired? Every parent in the cul-de-sac started keeping their kids indoors after sunset. The once friendly neighborhood where kids rode bikes in circles turned into a row of closed blinds and locked doors. One Friday evening, the breaking point arrived. Richard came home drunk, at least that's what it looked like, and started shouting at the Sanders family because their porch light was on too late. His voice carried through the cul-de-sac like a siren, and people cracked their blinds to watch. Then he slammed his truck door so hard it echoed, and I could see him fumbling at his waistband, like he was ready to show the gun again. Every parent grabbed their kids and pulled them back from the windows. This time, though, several neighbors called the police all at once, practically flooding dispatch with urgent pleas. When the officers arrived, Richard tried his usual act, calm voice, arms crossed, playing the misunderstood homeowner. But this time, something shifted. One neighbor had managed to capture the entire outburst on video from their second-floor window, audio included. The recording clearly showed him screaming threats while reaching for the weapon. Faced with undeniable proof, the officers had no choice but to detain him. For the first time in months, we felt like the balance had tipped in our favor, even if just slightly. Ellen stood in the doorway while they handcuffed him, her face pale but strangely still. When Richard was taken away, she finally stepped outside, clutching a sweater around her shoulders even though the air was warm. She didn't say much, just whispered a quiet thank you to the nearest neighbor before retreating back inside. That one word carried the weight of everything she hadn't been able to speak. Nobody pushed her for details. We just let the silence hang, respecting the fragility of the moment. After that night, the neighborhood slowly started to breathe again. Kids rode their bikes in the circle like they used to, and we even had a small block cookout a few weeks later to remind ourselves that community could outlast fear. Richard never came back. Word spread that he'd been forced to move after multiple charges piled up. Even now, though, when I sit on my porch and hear the distant hum of a truck engine, there's a part of me that tenses. It's a reminder of how quickly one person can poison a whole street, and how much it takes for ordinary people to stand together when the danger is right outside their doors. I still remember that afternoon so clearly because it started in the most uneventful way. I was 16, stuck at home while my parents worked late, killing time between homework and video games. Our apartment was quiet, just the hum of the fridge and the muffled TV from the neighbors below. It felt like one of those long days where nothing ever happens, until the knock at the door broke the silence. I thought it might be a delivery or maybe a friend dropping by unannounced. But instead, it was the guy from down the hall. His name was Mark, and he looked flustered, almost sweaty, clutching his jacket like he was hiding something inside it. He asked if he could use my phone, said his cell had died and he needed to make a quick call. It didn't strike me as odd right away. He was a neighbor, someone I'd seen countless times taking the trash out or checking his mail. He always kept to himself, but that wasn't unusual in our building. I let him in, telling myself it would only take a minute. He stepped past me quickly, eyes darting toward the living room like he was checking if anyone else was home. I brushed it off, figuring maybe he was just embarrassed about asking for help. As he dialed, he kept shifting from one foot to the other, tapping his fingers against the counter. The call seemed short. I didn't hear him say much before he hung up. That's when the second knock came. Harder, sharper, like someone pounding with urgency. My first thought was maybe another neighbor, but the voice on the other side shattered that idea. "Police, open up!" My chest tightened, and Mark's head snapped toward me. In one motion, he shoved the phone back on the counter and whispered harshly, "Don't say I'm here." Before I could process, he rushed into my bedroom and yanked open the closet door. I just stood there, frozen in disbelief as he squeezed himself inside, pulling the door shut behind him. A dozen questions collided in my head. Why the cops? Why my apartment? What had I just let in? The pounding at the door grew louder, and I realized I didn't have time to think. I opened the door to find two officers staring back at me, hands resting near their holsters, eyes scanning over my shoulder like they already knew what they'd find inside. The officers stepped inside without hesitation, their boots heavy against the worn carpet. One of them, taller and broad-shouldered, asked if anyone else was in the apartment. My throat felt dry, and I could only shake my head while trying to act calm. They split up fast, one moving toward the kitchen while the other made a straight line for the hallway where my bedroom was. I remember the sound of my closet door rattling as it was yanked open, followed by a shout that made every hair on my neck stand up. Mark was dragged out in seconds, thrashing and cursing, his jacket slipping off to reveal scratches down his arm, like he'd clawed at something earlier. The officer pinned him against the wall while his partner snapped cuffs around his wrists. I stood in the doorway, watching this surreal scene unfold in my own room. The neat stacks of books on my shelf, the posters on my wall, all suddenly looked strange with him pressed against them, snarling like an animal cornered. I couldn't reconcile the quiet neighbor from down the hall with the man being hauled out right in front of me. One officer stayed back to ask me questions, his tone firm but not unkind. He wanted to know how long Mark had been inside, if I knew him personally, if he'd said anything suspicious. I kept answering as best I could, stumbling over my words. All I could really explain was that he'd asked to use my phone, and I let him in because I thought it was harmless. The officer nodded, scribbling notes, then said something that sent a chill through me. "You're lucky. He's been running since this morning after assaulting someone 2 buildings over." When they finally marched Mark out, the hallway outside was lined with curious neighbors peeking through their doors. I felt exposed, standing there in my doorway with everyone staring. The officers gave me a final warning to always keep my door locked and be cautious, even with people I thought I knew. Once they left, the apartment felt unnaturally silent again, but not the comfortable kind. It was the kind of silence where every creak and shadow made me second-guess myself. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my room. The closet door still stood half open, and I couldn't shake the image of him crouched inside it, waiting. The next day at school, word had already spread. A couple of kids from the building lived nearby and must have seen the police cars, so by lunch I was already the center of whispers. People asked if I was scared, if I knew he was dangerous, if he'd threatened me. I kept giving the same answer. No, I had no idea. But deep down I replayed every little detail. How fast he moved past me, the way his eyes scanned my living room, as if the clues had been there all along and I'd just ignored them. That evening, my parents sat me down for a long talk. They weren't angry, but I could see the worry in their faces. My mom said that trust is a dangerous thing when you don't know someone well, and my dad kept shaking his head, repeating that I should never open the door when I'm home alone. They tried to make me feel better, but nothing really erased the image of officers dragging Mark out of my closet, his face twisted with rage, as if he hated me for letting them in. For weeks afterward, I couldn't walk down our hallway without feeling watched. Even after Mark was gone, locked up somewhere I assumed, I caught myself glancing at neighbors differently, wondering who they really were behind closed doors. I'd lived in that building for years without thinking twice about the people around me. But one moment of misplaced trust turned the whole place into a stage for suspicion. The sound of footsteps outside my door at night made me hold my breath, waiting to see if someone would knock again. It's been years since that day, but I still lock every door behind me the second I come inside. Friends joke that I'm paranoid, but they don't know what it's like to have a fugitive crouched in your closet while the police storm your home. That was the moment I realized how quickly ordinary life can tilt into something terrifying, and how fragile the sense of safety really is. Even now, I can't open that closet without remembering the scrape of the hinges and the chaos that followed. That particular evening was quiet enough that I could hear the hum of my refrigerator from across the apartment. I lived in a modest one-bedroom, the kind of place you rent when you're more focused on saving than impressing anyone. My days were predictable. Work, gym, dinner, then either a book or mindless TV until I was tired enough to sleep. Nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen there, which was part of why I chose the place. The walls were thin, sure, but in a building like this you learn to live with the occasional footsteps or voices leaking through from the neighbors. It was background noise, almost comforting in a way. The first time the banging happened, I was halfway through a late-night rerun. It came from the wall I shared with the apartment next door, sharp and uneven, like someone slamming a heavy object against plaster. My initial thought was that somebody was clumsy while moving furniture or maybe hanging something on the wall way too late at night. I muted the TV for a second, listened, then shrugged it off when it went quiet. In places like this, you don't overthink every noise, or you'll drive yourself insane. Days rolled into weeks, and nothing about that night seemed worth remembering until the landlord mentioned something odd. We ran into each other by the mailboxes, and he made an offhand comment about people complaining of domestic disputes in the apartment next to mine. He said it in a dismissive tone, like gossip he didn't want to be dragged into. But the words lingered with me. I had never heard shouting or anything that suggested a fight, just those occasional bangs that didn't fit neatly into any explanation. Then it happened again, this time more violent, more insistent. I was lying in bed, drifting off, when the wall rattled hard enough to make a picture frame tilt. There was no rhythm to it, just frantic pounding mixed with something else, low, muffled sounds that didn't register right away. I sat up, straining to separate the noises, and realized it wasn't furniture, and it wasn't random clumsiness. It was crying, quiet, stifled, almost swallowed by the walls, but it was there, carried through the plaster like a whisper no one was meant to hear. I stayed awake for hours that night, staring at the wall as if it might explain itself. Every so often the banging would start up again, followed by those muffled cries that sent a chill through me. I wanted to believe it was just an argument, maybe someone hitting the wall out of frustration. But the sounds didn't match that theory. They were desperate, drawn out, The kind of noises that make you realize someone is in trouble but has no way to say it out loud. Sleep never came easy after that. I found myself listening for it even on nights when the apartment was silent. The strange part was how normal everything seemed during the day. I'd pass neighbors in the hall, exchange nods or a quick, "Hey," and nothing ever seemed amiss. The guy who lived next door, at least the one I assumed was responsible, was a quiet man I rarely saw. Mid-30s maybe, a little disheveled. The kind of person who avoided eye contact and kept his head down. He carried groceries in reusable bags, smoked occasionally on the balcony, but never struck me as threatening. Still, the thought that those cries might have come from his apartment made me start paying more attention whenever I saw him. The noise escalated one Friday night. I had friends over for pizza and a movie, and halfway through the film, the pounding started again. My friends exchanged glances, whispering things like, "What the hell is that?" I tried to laugh it off, said something about thin walls and neighbors with bad tempers, but the tension in the room was obvious. The sound was relentless, echoing like fists slamming into drywall, until one of my friends muttered that it sounded more like someone was trying to get out rather than in. That comment lodged itself deep in my mind and refused to leave. After that evening, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I found myself hesitating by the shared wall, ear tilted toward the faintest noises, trying to piece together what was happening next door. Some nights it was quiet, eerily so, like the apartment was empty. Other nights, the banging returned with a force that shook my shelves. The crying would rise and fall, then cut off abruptly, leaving me staring into the dark, wondering if I should knock on his door, call someone, or pretend none of it was my problem. That tug of war between fear and responsibility became my nightly routine. One night, the pounding reached a level that felt impossible to ignore. It was close to midnight, and I was reading in bed when the wall shook so violently that dust drifted down from the ceiling. The cries were clearer than ever, not words I could understand, but pleading all the same. I picked up my phone, thumb hovering over 911, but fear tangled me up. What if I was wrong? What if I ended up dragging myself into someone else's private mess? My pulse hammered in my ears as I sat there, caught between dialing and doing nothing, until suddenly the apartment fell into silence. Not a gradual fade, just silence as if someone had flipped a switch. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The blinds in the neighbor's apartment, usually half open with the faint glow of a lamp behind them, were drawn tightly shut. Later that day, while leaving for work, I realized his welcome mat was gone, along with the potted plant that had always sat by his door. The space looked stripped bare, like no one had ever lived there. When I asked the landlord about it, he simply said the tenant had moved out overnight. No warning, no notice, just vanished. His tone made it clear he didn't want to discuss it further. What unsettled me most wasn't the disappearance itself, but how abruptly the noise ended. For weeks, that banging and crying had been part of my nights, impossible to ignore. Then, in a single night, it was over, erased without explanation. I started second-guessing myself. Had I misheard, exaggerated the sounds in my own mind? But the tilted picture frame, the rattling shelves, even my friends who heard it firsthand, those things were real. Something had happened in that apartment, and it ended the moment he disappeared. To this day, I still find myself staring at that blank door whenever I walk past it, half expecting to hear the faint thud of fists against plaster again. No new tenant ever moved in. The apartment has stayed empty, at least as far as I can tell. Sometimes late at night I catch myself holding my breath, waiting for the silence to break. It never does, but the memory of those cries never really left. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The cruise was supposed to be our fresh start. Just me and my 6-year-old son Noah, sailing away from the messy divorce that had consumed the last 18 months of our lives. I'd saved for this trip for almost 2 years, picking up extra shifts at the hospital where I worked as a nurse, squirreling away every overtime dollar into a jar labeled New Beginnings. We boarded the ship in Miami on a humid Saturday morning in July 2018, and I remember thinking how massive the vessel looked from the dock. 12 decks of gleaming white metal and glass, with pools and restaurants and enough activities to keep Noah entertained for our 7-day Caribbean adventure. The other passengers seemed like typical cruise folks, families with kids, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries, honeymooners taking selfies against the railings. Noah was practically vibrating with excitement, clutching his little backpack with his Nintendo DS, and asking me every 5 minutes when we could go to the water slides. The first day was perfect, exactly what I'd imagined when I booked this trip. We explored the ship from top to bottom, Noah's eyes going wide at the rock-climbing wall, the mini golf course, the ice cream parlor that stayed open until midnight. We ate dinner at the buffet where he piled his plate high with mac and cheese and chocolate cake. And I didn't even scold him about vegetables because we were on vacation, damn it. And he deserved to just be a kid after everything he'd witnessed during the divorce proceedings. That night, after tucking him into the bottom bunk in our tiny interior cabin, I stood in our bathroom the size of a closet and looked at myself in the mirror. My brown hair was already getting lighter from just one day in the sun, and for the first time in forever, the bags under my eyes didn't look quite so dark. I actually felt hopeful. The ship's gentle rocking was soothing, and the hum of the engines created white noise that made Noah sleep deeper than he had in months. I fell asleep thinking about the snorkeling excursion we'd booked for Grand Cayman, imagining Noah's face when he saw tropical fish for the first time. Everything shifted on day 2. It started with something small, an announcement over the ship's PA system during breakfast. Attention passengers, would young Sofia Martinez please report to guest services on deck 4? Sofia Martinez to guest services. Noah was busy drowning his pancakes in syrup while I sipped my coffee, watching the ocean through the dining room's massive windows. 10 minutes later, another announcement. Christopher Johnson, please report to guest services. Christopher Johnson, 8 years old, wearing a blue Captain America shirt. That detail stuck with me. Why would they describe what the kid was wearing? I figured maybe the child was lost and they were helping the parents locate them. But then 20 minutes passed and another name was called. Isabella Thompson, 7 years old, last seen near the splash zone on deck 11. The woman at the table next to us, traveling with her 3 kids, caught my eye and shrugged. Busy morning for lost kids, she said with a nervous laugh. I nodded, but something was gnawing at me. In my 12 years working pediatric nursing, I'd developed a 6th sense for when things weren't right with children. By lunchtime, they'd called 6 more names, always children between ages 5 and 9, always with those specific details, what they were wearing, where they were last seen. But here's what made my pulse quicken. I never saw any of these kids being reunited with their families. Not once did I witness a relieved parent hugging their lost child near guest services. I started paying attention, really watching. The pool deck was packed with families, kids running around with soft-serve cones dripping down their arms, parents lounging on deck chairs slathered in sunscreen. But I began noticing other things too. There were staff members who didn't quite fit, men in cruise uniforms who weren't serving drinks or cleaning or leading activities. They were just watching. One guy in particular, tall and thin with acne scars across his cheeks, kept walking the same route around the main pool, his eyes scanning the crowd. He wore a legitimate crew badge, but something about how he moved set off every alarm in my head. When Noah asked if he could go down the water slide alone, it was just a short walk from where I was sitting. I heard myself saying no, even though normally I would have let him. "But Mom, I'm not a baby," he whined. I pulled him closer and told him we'd go together in a few minutes. That afternoon, we were at the kids' club entrance on deck 7. Noah wanted to join the treasure hunt activity, and I figured it would be safe. It was a supervised program in an enclosed space with security check-in. While I was filling out the permission form, a man approached us. He was maybe 40, clean-shaven, wearing the cruise line's bright yellow kids club staff shirt with a name tag that read Kevin. But his shirt was too new, still had the fold creases from the package, and his name tag was slightly crooked. "Hey there, buddy," he said to Noah, completely ignoring me at first. "You here for the treasure hunt?" "Actually, we moved it to the arcade on deck 12. Way cooler prizes up there. Want me to take you?" Noah's face lit up. He'd been begging to go to the arcade since we boarded. He took a step toward the man, and that's when my body reacted before my brain. I grabbed Noah's shoulder, probably harder than necessary. "We'll go together," I said, my voice coming out sharp. The man's friendly expression flickered for just a second, a flash of irritation, maybe anger, before the smile returned. "Oh, parents aren't allowed in this special event. Insurance reasons. But I promise he'll have a blast." The real kids club supervisor, a young woman with a Brazilian accent, looked up from her desk. "Kevin? I don't know any Kevin. And the treasure hunt is right here, ma'am, in our main room." The man didn't run. That's what chilled me the most. He just walked away, casually, like nothing had happened. The supervisor called security, but by the time they arrived, he'd vanished into the maze of corridors and decks. Security took my statement, said they'd look into it, but their tone suggested this was just another paranoid parent overreacting. Noah was upset that we left without doing the treasure hunt, but I couldn't get my heart rate back to normal. I kept replaying the moment. How quickly Noah had been ready to go with this stranger. How the man knew exactly what would appeal to my son. We went back to our cabin, and I locked the door, putting the chain on, even though I knew it was probably useless. I let Noah play his DS while I sat on my bunk, trying to process what had almost happened. The announcements continued over the PA system. "Madison Walker, 9 years old. Please report to guest services." Every time I held Noah a little tighter. I started a list in my phone, writing down every name they called, the times, the descriptions. By dinner time, I had 14 names. 14 children whose names echoed through the ship's speakers, but who never seemed to materialize anywhere. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the ship, every footstep in the hallway outside made me sit up in the dark. Noah was out cold, but I kept checking on him, making sure he was still there in his bunk. Around 3 a.m., I heard voices in the corridor, hushed but urgent. I pressed my ear against the door and caught fragments. "Cozumel tomorrow. Easier at the port. The Mexican contact." Then footsteps moving away. I wanted to open the door, see who it was, but I couldn't risk leaving Noah alone, not even for a second. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor between his bunk and the door, my phone in one hand and the cabin phone in the other, ready to call security at the slightest sound. The next morning I was exhausted but wired on adrenaline. At breakfast I started talking to other parents, casually at first. "Hey, did you hear all those announcements yesterday? So many lost kids." Most hadn't really noticed. They were on vacation, drinks flowing, kids in various programs. But one mother, a pediatrician from Dallas named Jennifer, had noticed. She pulled me aside near the omelet station. "My daughter's friend from the teen club said she saw security footage being reviewed yesterday. 3 kids who were called over the PA were seen leaving the ship at Nassau Port with adults who weren't their parents. The staff told her it was a custody dispute thing, but..." She glanced around nervously. "Those kids' families never reported them missing." I asked at guest services. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. These weren't just announcements. They were shopping lists. Someone was using the PA system to mark targets, maybe to signal accomplices. The more I thought about it, the more it made horrible sense. International waters meant murky jurisdiction. ports in developing countries where documentation might be lax, a ship with thousands of passengers where kids naturally wandered off from parents. It was a perfect hunting ground. Jennifer and I exchanged numbers, promised to watch each other's kids, but I knew that wasn't enough. We were heading to Cozumel that day, the words I'd heard in the hallway suddenly taking on new meaning. I made a decision. We weren't leaving the cabin. I told Noah I wasn't feeling well, and miracle of miracles, he didn't argue much. Maybe he sensed my fear. We stayed locked in that tiny room, eating room service, watching movies on my laptop. But the announcements continued. Timothy Brooks, 6 years old, blue swimsuit, last seen near the mini golf course. Each name felt like a countdown to something terrible. The breaking point came on day 4. We'd stayed holed up through the Cozumel port day, but Noah was getting restless, crying about missing everything fun. Against my better judgment, I agreed to take him to the breakfast buffet early when it would be less crowded. We were there at 6:30 a.m., the dining room mostly empty except for a few elderly early risers. Noah was eating cereal when I noticed him, the acne-scarred man from the pool deck, now wearing a server's uniform, standing by the juice station but not actually working. He was watching us. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. Instead, he smiled and started walking toward our table. I stood up so fast I knocked over my coffee cup. "Noah, we're leaving. Now." But when I turned, another man was behind us. Younger, muscular, wearing a maintenance uniform. "Your son dropped this," he said, holding out a toy that wasn't Noah's. It was a distraction technique. I knew it instantly. The scarred man was now only 3 tables away. I grabbed Noah's hand and basically dragged him toward the nearest exit, but a third man appeared in the doorway. The fake Kevin from the kids' club. They were coordinating, boxing us in. That's when I did something I'm not proud of. I screamed. Not a help me scream, but a completely unhinged, "My child is having a seizure," scream that made everyone in the dining room turn. Noah looked at me in shock, but I pushed him to the floor and held his head, shouting for people to call medical. The elderly passengers rushed over, creating a crowd, and in the chaos, the 3 men melted away. They couldn't grab us with 20 witnesses surrounding us. Ship medical arrived with a wheelchair, and I kept up the act, saying Noah had childhood epilepsy, that I was a nurse, that we needed to get to the medical center immediately. Once we were in the medical bay with actual security present, I broke down and told them everything. The doctor, an older British woman named Dr. Whitmore, listened to my story while checking Noah over. She exchanged looks with the security chief, then quietly said, "You're not the first parent to report this. We've had 3 families leave the cruise early at previous ports after similar incidents." She pulled up something on her computer, then turned the screen away from us. "I'm going to recommend immediate disembarkation for medical reasons. There's a flight from Cozumel to Miami this afternoon. Security will escort you to pack and get off the ship." Her eyes were deadly serious. "Don't stop anywhere. Don't talk to anyone. Just pack and go." 2 security officers walked us to our cabin. Real security. With radios and serious expressions, not like the dismissive ones from before. While I threw our belongings into suitcases, one of them stood inside our room while the other guarded the hallway. Noah kept asking what was happening, why we were leaving, and I had to lie. "Mommy's really sick, baby. We need to go home." My hands shook as I zipped up the bags, remembering all those children's names called over the speakers. How many had actually made it home? The security officers took us down a service elevator I didn't even know existed, through corridors that passengers never see. Bare metal walls, exposed pipes, the underbelly of the floating city. We emerged at a crew exit on Deck 2, where a van was already waiting. The younger security officer, a Filipino man who'd been silent the whole time, suddenly grabbed my arm as we were about to get in the van. "Ma'am," he whispered, "delete any photos from the ship. Don't post about this online. These people, they have connections everywhere. Just go home and forget this cruise happened." His fear was so genuine it made my knees weak. During the ride to the airport, I held Noah so tight he complained he couldn't breathe. but I couldn't let go. I kept thinking about that fake Kevin, how he'd known exactly what my son wanted, how prepared they all were. We made it home to Ohio that night. The cruise line refunded our entire trip without me even asking, which told me everything I needed to know about how much they wanted this buried. For weeks after, I had nightmares about those announcements, about children's names echoing through speakers while their parents searched frantically. I called the FBI, filed a report, but the agent who took my statement seemed unsurprised, tired even. "International waters," he said, like that explained everything. "We're aware of the situation. Thank you for your report." That was it. No follow-up, no investigation that I ever heard about. Jennifer, the pediatrician from Dallas, texted me once to say they'd made it home safely too. Then her number was disconnected. I never found out what happened to the children whose names were called. Sometimes I Google them. Sophia Martinez missing. Christopher Johnson disappeared. But nothing ever comes up. It's like they never existed. Noah doesn't remember much about the cruise now, thank God. He just knows we came home early because Mom got sick. But I remember everything. The way those men moved through the ship like they belonged there. The casual efficiency of their hunting. The perfect cover of thousands of distracted tourists. Sometimes, when I'm at a crowded mall or amusement park and hear a child's name called over the loudspeaker, my whole body goes cold, and I find myself scanning the crowd, looking for men who are watching too closely, smiling too widely, wearing uniforms that don't quite fit. The Atlantic was rougher than usual that September, and most passengers had already retreated to their cabins by the time everything went sideways. I'd been on the ship for 3 days, one of those mid-sized vessels that runs the New York to Southampton route. Nothing glamorous but comfortable enough. My cabin was on the 7th floor, just a small room with a porthole that stayed fogged up from the temperature difference between the ocean air and the ship's heating system. After 8 years with Boston PD and another 2 running my own security consulting firm, I'd gotten pretty good at reading people, noticing patterns that didn't belong. My sister had practically forced this trip on me after my divorce papers came through, told me 7 days at sea would help me reset, stop obsessing over surveillance footage and threat assessments for corporate clients who paid too much for peace of mind. She wasn't wrong. The first couple days had been exactly the kind of mindless relaxation I needed. Mediocre food at the buffet, a comedy show that made me laugh exactly once, and long hours sitting on the deck watching the horizon bob up and down. Everything changed on night 3, right around 11:30 in the main lounge. I'd been sitting at the bar with a glass of bourbon, watching the bartender, a Romanian kid named Anton who couldn't have been older than 25, juggle drink orders from increasingly drunk passengers. That's when the shouting started near the casino entrance. 2 men, both in their 40s, expensive clothing but wearing it wrong, like they'd bought it specifically for this trip. The bigger one had shoulders that stretched his navy blazer to its limits, and when he shoved the smaller guy, it wasn't just anger. It was calculated, theatrical even. The smaller man crashed into a table where 4 women were playing cards, sending chips and drinks flying everywhere. Then I noticed something that made every instinct from my police days light up. 3 other men, scattered throughout the lounge, all stood up at exactly the same moment. They weren't rushing to help or gawking like everyone else. They were moving with purpose, converging on the scene like they'd rehearsed it. The next 60 seconds turned the lounge into complete chaos. While everyone was focused on the 2 men fighting, the 3 others who'd stood up pulled out knives. Not kitchen knives or pocket knives, but ceramic blades, the kind that don't set off metal detectors. One of them, a wiry guy with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, went straight for the purses and jewelry the card-playing women had left on their table. Another moved behind the bar where Anton stood frozen, and the third positioned himself at the main exit. The big guy who'd started the fight suddenly had a knife too, pressing it against the smaller man's throat while rifling through his pockets. That's when I realized the smaller man wasn't random. He was wearing a Patek Philippe watch worth at least 40 grand, and his wedding ring had a diamond that caught the light like a disco ball. The attackers had marked him earlier, probably watched him winning big at the casino or flashing cash at dinner. Nobody was screaming yet. It happened too fast for anyone to process what they were seeing. I'd left my service weapon at home, obviously. You can't bring guns on cruise ships. But I still had my tactical pen clipped to my pocket, a habit from the job. Without thinking it through, which was probably stupid, I stood up and moved toward the guy threatening Anton. He had the bartender's tip jar in one hand and his blade in the other, sweeping it back and forth to keep Anton pressed against the wall of bottles. I grabbed a heavy glass ashtray from the bar, they still had them even though nobody could smoke inside, and brought it down hard on the attacker's wrist. The crack was audible even over the growing panic in the room. His knife clattered across the floor, and Anton, bless him, didn't hesitate. He grabbed a bottle of vodka and smashed it over the guy's head, dropping him instantly. But that's when I made a mistake. I bent down to grab the ceramic knife, and when I stood back up, the scarred one was already moving toward me. His blade held low and professional, like someone who'd done this before. The lounge had erupted into full panic now. Passengers scrambling for exits, tables overturning, glass breaking everywhere. The scarred man lunged at me with a boxer's footwork, quick jabs with the blade that forced me backward toward the windows overlooking the dark ocean. I managed to parry twice with the knife I'd picked up, but this guy knew what he was doing. He feinted left, then slashed right, catching my forearm and opening a gash that immediately soaked my sleeve with blood. The pain was sharp and hot, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind him, I could see the big guy dragging the rich passenger toward a service door, still pressing the blade to his throat while his partner stuffed jewelry and wallets into a canvas bag. They were working fast, methodical, like they'd done this exact thing before. I kicked a chair into the scarred man's path, buying myself 2 seconds to grab a champagne bottle from an abandoned table. When he came at me again, I swung it like a baseball bat, connecting with his shoulder and spinning him sideways into the piano. That's when ship security finally showed up. 2 officers in white uniforms who looked like they'd never dealt with anything worse than a drunk passenger falling in the pool. They had batons but no guns, and they hesitated at the entrance, trying to make sense of the scene. The attackers didn't hesitate at all. The one at the exit whistled, sharp and loud like calling a dog, and suddenly they were all moving, abandoning their victims and loot, heading for different exits with practiced efficiency. The scarred one rolled away from the piano, clutching his shoulder but still mobile, and disappeared through a door marked crew only. The big guy shoved his hostage to the floor and vanished through the service entrance he'd been heading toward. Within 15 seconds, they were all gone, leaving behind a lounge that looked like a hurricane had hit it. Blood on the carpet, broken glass everywhere, passengers huddled behind overturned furniture, and me standing there with a slashed arm and a bloody champagne bottle, trying to explain to security that this wasn't just a bar fight gone wrong. The ship's medical center was on deck 3, and the doctor, a Hungarian woman named Dr. Kovac with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, stitched my arm while I tried to convince the head of security that we had a serious problem. Captain Morrison, finally someone who seemed competent, showed up 20 minutes later, still buttoning his uniform jacket. I laid it out for him. The ceramic weapons, the coordinated movements, the crew-only door escape routes, the fact that they'd targeted specific wealthy passengers. These weren't opportunistic thieves or drunk troublemakers. They'd studied the ship's layout, identified marks, and planned their exits. The captain's face went pale when I mentioned the ceramic knives. "Those don't show up on our scanners," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. Dr. Kovac paused mid-stitch when I described how they'd moved through the lounge, each man knowing exactly where to go. "How many passengers boarded in New York?" I asked. Morrison pulled out a tablet, scrolled through some files. 837, he said. "But we don't photograph passengers, only check passports against the manifest." I convinced Morrison to pull the security footage from embarkation day, and we spent the next 3 hours in a cramped office behind the bridge, watching grainy video on monitors that looked like they hadn't been upgraded since the 90s. Anton, who'd insisted on helping after his shift ended, turned out to have a photographer's eye for faces. He spotted them first, 5 men who'd boarded separately but all within the same 30-minute window, each carrying similar black duffel bags, each walking with that same controlled gait I'd noticed in the lounge. They'd spread out immediately after boarding, no acknowledgement of each other, but the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. We tracked them through the ship's cameras over the next 2 days. They ate at different restaurants, used different pools, never appeared together in public. But Anton noticed something I'd missed. They all had cabins on deck 2, the cheapest interior rooms, all in the same corridor. Who books 5 separate interior cabins on a transatlantic crossing? Anton asked, and that's when it clicked. I asked Morrison to check the booking records. All 5 reservations had been made on the same day, 6 weeks ago, all paid with prepaid credit cards, all using different travel agencies, but with sequential booking reference numbers. Morrison wanted to search their cabins immediately, but I stopped him. "They know we're onto them now," I said. "If we spook them, they might do something desperate. We're in the middle of the Atlantic, nowhere to run, but that also means nowhere for passengers to escape to either. Instead, I suggested we monitor them, figure out their next move." The captain agreed, assigning his 2 best security officers to shadow the corridors near their cabins. But these guys were smart. For the next 18 hours, none of them left their rooms. No room service orders, no bathroom breaks that we could detect, nothing. It was like they'd vanished inside those cabins. Then Anton, who'd been checking the dining records on his own initiative, found something interesting. Over the past 2 days, someone had been ordering massive amounts of food from the midnight buffet, enough for 15 people, and charging it to a cabin belonging to an elderly couple from Vermont, the Andersons, who'd been eating in the main dining room every night. When we checked the security footage from the buffet, we saw one of our suspects, the big guy from the fight, loading up multiple plates at 2 in the morning, then disappearing toward the service elevator. The pieces started coming together when Morrison pulled up the ship's blueprints. The service elevator from the buffet area connected to a maintenance corridor that ran along deck 2, right behind the row of cabins where our 5 suspects were staying. But here's what made my spine tingle. That same corridor led directly to the ship's storage hold, where passenger valuables were kept in safety deposit boxes. The cruise line marketed it as a secure service for travelers carrying expensive jewelry or large amounts of cash. Morrison's face went white when he realized what I was suggesting. "There's probably $3 million worth of items in that hold," he whispered. The attack in the lounge hadn't been the real crime. It was a distraction, a test run to see how security would respond, how long it would take, what kind of resistance they'd meet. They were planning something much bigger, and we were already on day 4 of a 7-day crossing. The next port was Southampton, but we had a brief stop in the Azores in 36 hours to refuel. If they were planning to rob the storage hold, they'd do it right before the Azores, then disappear into the Portuguese islands before anyone realized what had happened. We had less than 36 hours to stop them, and Morrison was already talking about alerting the Coast Guard, requesting a military escort, all the official procedures that would take too long and probably alert our suspects that we were onto them. I proposed something different. "Let them think they're invisible," I said, but we set a trap. The plan was risky but simple. We'd move all the real valuables out of the storage hold that night, replace them with fake jewelry and empty boxes, then wait for them to make their move. Morrison hesitated. The liability issues alone could end his career. But he knew we didn't have many options. That night, while most passengers were at the captain's formal dinner, Morrison, Anton, 2 trusted security officers, and I quietly emptied the storage hold. We packed everything into the captain's personal safe and 3 secured crew lockers, photographing each item for insurance purposes. Anton had a cousin who worked in the ship's theater, and we borrowed costume jewelry, spray-painted rocks to look like gold bars, Even filled some boxes with poker chips from the casino. By 4 in the morning, the storage hold looked exactly the same, but contained nothing worth more than a few $100s. The waiting was the worst part. 28 hours passed with no movement from their cabins. I started to doubt myself, wondering if maybe I'd misread the whole situation. Then, at exactly 3:15 a.m. on our last night before the Azores, the ship's fire alarm went off in the kitchen, a grease fire that required all available crew to respond. Except I'd been watching the kitchen cameras, and there was no fire. Someone had triggered the alarm manually. Morrison and I stayed hidden in a maintenance closet near the storage hold, while chaos erupted above us. Through the door's vent, we heard footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast, but quiet. They had a key card that shouldn't have existed, opening the hold like they owned the place. We waited until all 5 were inside. Then Morrison hit the emergency lockdown he'd rigged earlier. The magnetic locks engaged with a solid thunk, trapping them inside with their worthless haul. When security opened the door 20 minutes later, the 5 men were standing among scattered costume jewelry and spray-painted rocks, their canvas bags half filled with fake gold bars. The scarred one actually laughed when he realized what had happened, shaking his head like he appreciated the play. Portuguese police were waiting when we docked in the Azores 6 hours later, and the FBI met us in Southampton with a warrant for the whole crew. Turns out these guys were part of a Romanian crime ring that had hit 3 other cruise lines in the past 2 years. Always with the same method. Board with fake identities, create a distraction, then clean out the ship's valuables before vanishing at port. The FBI agent told me they'd stolen over $12 million total, always picking transatlantic routes where security was lighter and passengers carried more cash and jewelry. The ceramic knives were custom-made in Prague, designed specifically to beat ship security. What really got me was finding out about the inside help. A crew member in reservations had been feeding them information about wealthy passengers and cabin assignments for a cut of the profits. They caught him trying to board a flight to Bucharest the day after we docked. Morrison offered me a job as the cruise line's new head of security, but I turned it down. The ocean's beautiful and all, but I'll stick to land where criminals can't trap you in a metal box for 7 days. Anton ended up testifying at the trial and used the reward money to open his own bar in Boston. He named it the Ceramic Knife, which I told him was terrible marketing, but he didn't care. Sometimes I stop by for a drink and we talk about that night, how close those guys came to pulling off the perfect heist. My arm healed up fine, just left a thin white scar that aches when it rains. Every time I see a cruise ship advertisement now, I wonder how many people realize they're basically volunteering to be locked in a floating city with complete strangers, hoping everyone's exactly who they claim to be. The afternoon sun was beating down on the pool deck when everything changed. I was 38 then, managing a hardware store in Phoenix, and we'd saved for 2 years to take this cruise. Me, my wife Lisa, our teenage daughter Madison, and my dad Walter. He'd just turned 65 and retired from his job at the post office after 40 years. The man never took vacations, always said he'd travel when he retired, so we surprised him with this trip for his birthday. We were somewhere between Florida and Jamaica, second day at sea on a 7-day cruise that was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Dad was actually enjoying himself for once, laughing at Madison's attempts to teach him how to play shuffleboard, his face red from the sun despite the SPF 50 Lisa kept slathering on him. I remember the exact moment because Madison had just scored her first point and was doing this ridiculous victory dance when Dad's shuffleboard stick clattered onto the deck. His right hand was clutching his chest, fingers digging into his Hawaiian shirt, the ridiculous one with the parrots that Madison had bought him specifically for this trip. His face went from sunburn red to this awful grayish color in seconds. He tried to say something, but all that came out was this strangled gasp before his knees buckled. I caught him before he hit the deck, and his weight nearly took me down with him. His eyes were wide, terrified, and he kept grabbing at his chest like he was trying to tear something out. Lisa started screaming for help, while Madison stood there frozen, still holding her shuffleboard stick like she didn't understand what was happening. A crew member in a white uniform appeared within maybe 30 seconds, felt like hours, and immediately called for medical on his radio. They brought a wheelchair, but Dad couldn't even sit up properly. He kept slumping forward, his breathing coming in these horrible wheezes. We ended up carrying him, me under his arms, the crew member taking his legs, while Lisa ran ahead, clearing the path through the crowds of sunbathers who were all staring now. The medical center was down on deck 2, tucked behind the photo gallery where they try to sell you overpriced pictures of yourself boarding the ship. The smell hit me first, not the antiseptic hospital smell you'd expect, but this weird mixture of mildew and air freshener, like they were trying to cover up something. The waiting area had 3 plastic chairs and a water cooler that was empty, just the blue bottle sitting there collecting dust. The doctor, though I'm still not sure he was actually a doctor, introduced himself as Dr. Petrov, speaking with a thick Eastern European accent. He was maybe 28, 30 at most, with acne scars on his cheeks and medical scrubs that looked like they'd been washed too many times, all faded and thin. The nurse with him, a woman named Carla from the Philippines, at least seemed to know what she was doing. She got Dad onto the examination table, which was really just a padded bench bolted to the wall, and started checking his vitals. Dr. Petrov listened to Dad's chest with a stethoscope that looked older than me, then turned to us with this expression that made my stomach clench. "Is probable cardiac event," he said, like he was telling us Dad had a cold. "We give aspirin, monitor. Next port is 10, maybe 12 hours. He's stable enough." But Dad didn't look stable. His lips had this bluish tinge, and he kept clutching at his chest, tears streaming down his face from the pain. Lisa lost it then, and I'd never seen my wife like that in 16 years of marriage. She grabbed Dr. Petrov by his faded scrubs, actually grabbed him, and started shouting about helicopters, about calling the Coast Guard, about doing something real instead of just watching her father-in-law die. The doctor just stood there, blinking rapidly, while Carla gently pried Lisa's hands away. "Ma'am, please understand," Carla said quietly, her voice steady but her eyes showing she knew exactly how bad this was. "The helicopter evacuation costs minimum $50,000. Insurance usually no cover, and we need approval from corporate office first. Can take 4 or 5 hours just for paperwork." She showed us the medical supply cabinet then, probably trying to reassure us they had equipment, but it was pathetic. Some bandages, basic medications in bottles with labels so faded you could barely read them, an oxygen tank that looked like it belonged in a museum, and an EKG machine with a cracked screen held together with medical tape. Dad started vomiting then, this violent heaving that had him crying out in pain with each spasm. Dr. Petrov seemed genuinely surprised, like this wasn't in whatever manual he'd memorized. He fumbled with the oxygen tank, trying to get the mask on Dad's face, but the elastic strap snapped the moment he stretched it. He had to hold it manually while Carla searched for tape. I asked about nitroglycerin, about clot-busting drugs, about anything I'd heard of from medical shows, and Petrov just shook his head. "We don't stock such things. Too expensive, expire too fast, corporate policy." That's when I noticed the defibrillator in the corner, covered in dust with a note taped to it that said, "Out of order, awaiting parts." Madison was sobbing in the corner, calling her grandfather's name, while Dad's breathing got more labored, each breath sounding like he was drowning in his own lungs. The next 3 hours were the longest of my life. We took turns holding that oxygen mask to Dad's face because they only had 1 roll of medical tape, and it wasn't strong enough to hold the weight. Carla kept checking his pulse manually because the heart monitor's battery was dead, and the replacement was on order from corporate. Dr. Petrov disappeared for an hour, and when he came back, he smelled like cigarettes and wouldn't meet our eyes. Around hour 2, Dad started having what Carla quietly called episodes. His whole body would go rigid, eyes rolling back, lasting maybe 20 or 30 seconds each time. After the third one, Even Petrov looked scared. He finally admitted he'd only been working cruise ships for 3 months, that he'd been a general practitioner in Romania for just 2 years before this, mostly dealing with colds and stomach bugs. The cruise line had hired him because he'd work for a third of what American doctors wanted. I'll never forget the conversation with the cruise director who showed up around hour 4. Gregory something or other, this spray-tanned guy in his 40s with veneers so white they hurt to look at, wearing a uniform with more fake gold than a costume shop. He walked in while Dad was mid-episode, waited for it to pass like it was just an inconvenience, then launched into this rehearsed speech about liability and international maritime law. "Your father signed a waiver when he boarded," he said, pulling out his phone to show me the terms and conditions nobody ever reads. Section 47B clearly states that medical facilities are limited and guests travel at their own risk. When Lisa started crying harder, he offered us a 20% discount on our next cruise and free drink packages for the rest of this trip. I wanted to throw him through the porthole, but I couldn't leave Dad's side. His skin had gone from gray to almost translucent, and I could see the veins in his temples pulsing irregularly, sometimes racing, sometimes barely moving at all. By hour 6, other passengers had started gathering outside the medical center. Word had gotten around the ship, and people were recording with their phones through the small window in the door. Some woman from Kansas City actually knocked and asked if we could keep it down because they were trying to enjoy the comedy show next door. That's when I snapped. I stormed out into the hallway and told everyone exactly what was happening, how the defibrillator was broken, how they wouldn't call for evacuation, how the doctor admitted he wasn't qualified, everything. People started posting it on social media immediately. Within an hour, Gregory was back, this time with the captain, a Norwegian man named Eriksson who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. They offered to call for evacuation now, but only if we signed papers absolving the cruise line of all responsibility, and agreed to pay all costs up front. They had a credit card machine right there, ready to charge us the $50,000 deposit. Madison was the one who thought of calling the news. While Lisa and I argued with the captain about the evacuation, she used the ship's Wi-Fi, $15 for 30 minutes, because even in an emergency they were nickel and diming us, to email every news station she could find. She sent them videos of the broken equipment, recordings of Gregory's speech about liability, pictures of the out-of-order defibrillator. CNN actually called back within 20 minutes, and suddenly Captain Eriksson's phone started ringing non-stop. The cruise line's corporate office was in full panic mode. They approved the helicopter evacuation, but by then we'd been in that moldy medical center for 7.5 hours. Dad had stopped having episodes, which Carla said wasn't necessarily good news. He was barely responsive, his pulse so weak she had to check it at his neck because she couldn't find it at his wrist anymore. The helicopter arrived at hour 9, and getting Dad up to the landing pad was a nightmare I still dream about. The ship's elevator to the upper deck was undergoing maintenance, so 6 crew members had to carry him up 4 flights of stairs on a stretcher that was held together with duct tape on one corner. One of the handles actually broke midway, and this kid who couldn't have been older than 19 had to bear Dad's weight on his shoulder. The wind on the top deck was brutal, the helicopter hovering but unable to land because the cruise ship's landing pad hadn't been certified in 3 years. Another cost-cutting measure. They had to lower a rescue basket, and watching them load my unconscious father into it, his body limp as a rag doll while the basket swayed in the wind 30 feet above the deck, was the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Lisa couldn't watch, and Madison filmed everything, later telling me she did it because she wanted evidence if something went wrong. Dad survived, barely. The doctors at the hospital in Fort Lauderdale said another hour, and he would have been gone. He'd had a massive heart attack, and the lack of proper treatment for those 9 hours had caused additional damage. His heart function was down to 30%. He spent 3 weeks in the ICU, had to have triple bypass surgery, and now, 2 years later, he still can't walk up a flight of stairs without stopping to rest. The medical bills hit $400,000, and the cruise line fought us on every penny, claiming we'd refused their initial treatment plan and created the delay ourselves by involving the media. We're still in litigation, but at least Dad is alive. The cruise line never admitted fault, just quietly settled the CNN story with a statement about reviewing their medical preparedness protocols. Dr. Petrov still works for them, just on a different ship. I know because Madison found him on social media, posting pictures from the crew deck, smiling like nothing ever happened. They did fix the defibrillator, though. That made it into their press release about their commitment to passenger safety. "22 years old, and I'd never been on anything bigger than my uncle's fishing boat back in Colorado. But there I was, standing on deck 7 of this massive ship, watching the Mexican coastline fade into darkness, while 4,000 other passengers partied around me. I'd saved for 2 years waiting tables at a greasy diner in Denver, pulling double shifts every weekend, telling myself it would all be worth it once I finally got on that ship. My roommate Ashley thought I was crazy to go alone, kept saying I should wait until we could go together after she saved up. But I needed this trip. I needed to prove to myself that I could do something big without anyone holding my hand. The first 2 days had been incredible, snorkeling at our port stop, meeting other solo travelers at the poolside mixers, eating more shrimp at the buffet than any human probably should. That third night, I decided to splurge on the steakhouse, the one where you had to make reservations and pay an extra $70 just to walk through the door. The dining room had these floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, candle-lit tables with actual cloth napkins, and servers who remembered your name after hearing it once. My waiter, this guy named Dominic with a thick Italian accent, recommended the ribeye with herb butter, said it was the best cut they'd gotten in weeks. When that plate arrived, I'm not gonna lie, I took like 5 photos before even picking up my fork. The steak was thick as a dictionary, charred black on the edges but bleeding pink inside, swimming in this green butter that had chunks of garlic and rosemary. First bite tasted a little metallic, kind of sharp on my tongue, but Dominic assured me that was just the dry aging process, something about enzymes breaking down the proteins. The couple next to me, the Brennans from Wisconsin, were celebrating their 40th anniversary, and Mr. Brennan kept joking that his steak was so good he might leave his wife for the chef. We laughed, shared travel stories, and I cleaned my entire plate, even sopping up the leftover butter with the complimentary bread. Around midnight, I woke up to my stomach doing these weird flips, like when you miss a step going downstairs and your whole body lurches. The room was pitch black except for this thin strip of moonlight coming through the balcony door, and the ship was rocking more than usual, making everything worse. I tried to ignore it, told myself I'd just eaten too much too fast, maybe mixed too many foods at once. But then came this sharp twisting pain right below my ribs, like someone was wringing out my intestines like a wet towel. I barely made it to the tiny bathroom before everything came up. The steak, the potatoes, the 3 mojitos I'd had at the pool bar earlier. All of it burning my throat on the way back up. The vomiting wouldn't stop. These violent waves that left me hugging the toilet, my whole body shaking and covered in cold sweat. Between episodes, I noticed something that made my chest tighten with panic. The vomit had this dark, almost coffee ground texture to it, and there were these red streaks that definitely weren't from anything I'd eaten. I tried calling guest services from the phone next to the bed, but the line just rang and rang. No answer. My roommate for the cruise, this girl named Bethany from Oregon who I'd been matched with through the solo traveler program, wasn't in her bed, probably still at the nightclub on deck 12. I grabbed my room key, shoved my feet into flip-flops, and stumbled out into the hallway. One hand pressed against my stomach, the other trailing along the wall for support. The corridors were empty, just these endless stretches of identical doors and that weird cruise ship carpet, with the swirling patterns that made my nausea worse. Every few steps, I had to stop and lean against the wall, breathing through my nose, trying not to throw up again. The infirmary was on deck 2, according to the map I'd studied on the first day, which meant taking the elevator down 5 floors. While waiting for it to arrive, I heard someone else retching behind a nearby door, then another door further down. These horrible gagging sounds echoing through the hallway. The elevator took forever, and when it finally opened, there were already 3 people inside, all of them looking as rough as I felt. This middle-aged man in a Disney cruise shirt was bent over, gripping the handrail, his face this greenish-gray color I'd never seen on human skin before. A woman, maybe in her 30s, was sitting on the floor in the corner, holding a plastic ice bucket that reeked of bile. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. A teenage boy was slumped against the back wall, his legs shaking so bad his knees kept knocking together. Nobody said anything. We just stood there in our misery as the elevator crawled down, stopping at every single floor to pick up more sick passengers. By deck 4, we were packed in like sardines, 12 or 13 of us, the air thick with the smell of sweat and vomit and fear. This elderly woman next to me kept whispering, "This isn't right, this isn't right," over and over, clutching a rosary in her trembling fingers. When the elevator doors opened on deck 2, I thought I was hallucinating. The hallway leading to the infirmary was packed with people, a line stretching all the way back to the crew quarters. There must have been 60, maybe 70 passengers, all in various states of distress. Some were sitting on the floor with their backs against the walls, heads between their knees. Others were standing but swaying, using the walls or their companions for support. I saw Mrs. Brennan from dinner, the sweet lady from Wisconsin, throwing up into a trash bag while her husband rubbed her back, his own face pale and sweaty. There were parents carrying limp children, a pregnant woman crying while her partner fanned her with a cruise brochure, and near the front of the line, a man had actually passed out, lying flat on that ugly carpet while his wife screamed for help. The smell hit me like a physical force, human waste, vomit, and underneath it all, this metallic scent that reminded me of the steak from dinner, making my stomach clench all over again. I took my place at the end of the line, sliding down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, my knees pulled up to my chest. The woman next to me, still wearing her evening dress from whatever fancy event she'd attended, told me she'd been waiting for 2 hours already. 2 hours. She said the infirmary only had 1 doctor and 2 nurses for the entire ship, and they were completely overwhelmed. People who'd made it inside were coming back out saying the doctor was just giving everyone the same medicine, some generic anti-nausea pills, and sending them back to their rooms. No IV fluids for dehydration, no real examination, just pills and a pat on the back. The woman's husband had gone to find water somewhere, she said, because the crew had stopped responding to room service calls, and the nearest working water fountain was 3 decks up. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and when she tried to stand up to adjust her position, her legs gave out completely, sending her crashing back to the floor. After another hour of waiting, barely moving forward in line, I watched a crew member in a white uniform push through the crowd, heading for the infirmary doors. People were grabbing at him, begging for help, for water, for information, but he just kept his head down and pushed forward. When he reached the doors, I heard him speaking rapidly into his radio, in what sounded like Filipino, and I caught a few words in English: containment, corporate, and media blackout. The doors opened just long enough for him to slip inside, and in that brief moment, I glimpsed the chaos within. Gurneys lining the walls with people hooked up to IVs, a nurse running between patients, and the doctor, this exhausted-looking Indian man, arguing with someone in a suit who was definitely not medical staff. The suit was waving papers around, pointing at the sick passengers, shaking his head violently. Then the doors closed again, and we were left in the hallway with our suffering, the line not moving at all anymore. My dehydration was getting dangerous. I could feel it in the way my vision kept going dark at the edges, how my tongue felt like sandpaper against the roof of my mouth. The woman in the evening dress had stopped responding when people talked to her, just staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes. I knew I needed fluids desperately, but when I tried to stand up to go search for water, the hallway tilted sideways and I crashed into the wall, my legs like jelly. That's when this crew member, a young Filipino guy who couldn't have been older than 19, knelt down next to me. He looked around nervously, then pressed a half-empty water bottle into my hands, whispering in accented English that I needed to get back to my room immediately. He said the restaurant on deck 7, the fancy one where I'd eaten. Their freezer had broken 2 days ago, but management made them serve the meat anyway. Over 300 people had eaten there in the last 48 hours. He said corporate was flying in their own doctors tomorrow morning. But tonight, they were under strict orders to minimize treatment, to avoid creating a paper trail that could lead to lawsuits. Before I could ask him anything else, his supervisor appeared, barking at him in Tagalog, and he scrambled away. But his words kept spinning in my head as I sipped the precious water. Broken freezer, 300 sick people, minimizing treatment. I started noticing things I'd missed before in my misery. The crew members weren't drinking the ship's water. They all had sealed bottles from some external supplier. The security guards at the end of the hallway were wearing medical masks, something I'd never seen on a cruise before. And most telling of all, I spotted 2 passengers from first class, the ones who'd been at the captain's table that first night, being escorted through a side door directly into the infirmary, bypassing the entire line. The woman next to me saw it too and started crying, not from pain but from rage, realizing that even here, even in this nightmare, money determined who got saved first. She tried to scream about it, to alert the others, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat too damaged from hours of vomiting. Around 5 in the morning, after I'd been in that hallway for nearly 5 hours, something shifted. The man in the suit came out of the infirmary with 2 security officers, and they started moving through the crowd, checking room numbers on people's key cards. When they got to me, the suit looked at his tablet, frowned, and told the security guards to escort me back to my room. I tried to protest, told him I needed medical attention, that I could barely stand, but he just smiled this cold corporate smile and said the doctor had determined I was well enough to recover in my cabin. The security guards lifted me up by my arms, and I was too weak to fight them. As they half-carried, half-dragged me toward the elevator, I heard the suit telling others the same thing, clearing out the hallway by force. The pregnant woman was sobbing, begging for help, but they just kept moving people out. The man who'd been unconscious on the floor was being loaded onto a luggage cart, his wife stumbling along behind, and nobody was even pretending to provide medical care anymore. They dumped me in my room and told me to stay there until further notice. That room service would bring me electrolyte drinks and crackers within the hour. Of course, nothing came. Bethany, my roommate, was in her bed, curled up in a ball, her sheets soaked with sweat. She'd been sick too, had tried to get help around 3 in the morning but never even made it to the infirmary, collapsing in the elevator. Another passenger had dragged her back to our room and left her there. We spent the next 18 hours taking turns in the bathroom, sharing the last of our bottled water, listening to the chaos in the hallway as more and more people got sick. I found out later when we finally docked in Mexico that 43 passengers had to be hospitalized immediately. 7 ended up in intensive care, and 2 elderly passengers actually died during that nightmare night at sea. The cruise line offered us a 25% discount on a future cruise as compensation, made us sign papers saying we wouldn't talk to the media, wouldn't post on social media, wouldn't sue. Most people signed just to get off that floating petri dish. I didn't sign anything, which is why I can tell you this story now, why I'm naming the cruise line Royal Atlantic Ventures, ship designation Paradise Queen, sailing out of Galveston on March 15, 2022. I spent 22 years fighting fires in Chicago, but nothing in all that time prepared me for what happened last April aboard the Celestial Dream. My daughter Megan had convinced me to take that Mediterranean cruise about 6 months after I retired. Kept saying I deserved it after all those years of service, that I needed to finally relax and see the world beyond smoke and sirens. She'd found this deal online, 10 days through the Mediterranean, and basically wouldn't take no for an answer. even drove me to the airport herself to make sure I actually went. The ship was massive, one of those floating cities with 8 restaurants, 3 pools, and enough activities to keep 2,000 passengers busy for weeks. We'd been at sea for 4 days, had just left Barcelona that morning heading toward Nice, and I was actually starting to enjoy myself, learning to play shuffleboard with a group of retirees from Michigan who'd adopted me into their morning coffee club. The weather had been perfect the entire trip, that kind of Mediterranean sunshine you see in travel magazines, calm seas that barely made you remember you were floating on thousands of feet of water. That afternoon started like any other. I'd just finished lunch at the buffet on Deck 7, grilled salmon with those fancy little potatoes they served every day, and was heading down to my cabin for a quick nap before the evening's entertainment. The first sign something was wrong came around 3:30 when I noticed the horizon through my porthole window had this strange dark purple color, like a fresh bruise spreading across the sky. Then came the announcement from the captain, very calm, very professional, telling us we might experience some rough seas and suggesting passengers secure any loose items in their cabins. I remember thinking it was odd how the crew members I passed in the hallway were moving with this urgent efficiency, not quite running, but definitely not strolling, their faces tight with something I recognized from my firefighting days, that controlled concern professionals get when they know something civilians don't yet understand. Within 20 minutes, the ship started this slow, unnatural rocking that made my coffee mug slide across the desk in my cabin. I went out to the balcony, and what I saw made every instinct from 2 decades of emergency response kick in. Waves that looked like moving buildings, white foam spraying up higher than our deck, and that purple sky had turned into something biblical, clouds so black and low you could almost touch them. Other passengers were still walking around, some taking photos, completely oblivious to what was coming. But I started gathering my important stuff, passport, wallet, medications, and put them in a waterproof bag I always travel with, old habits from the job. I tried calling Megan, but the satellite connection was already getting spotty. Managed to send her a quick text saying we hit rough weather, but everything was fine. Didn't want to worry her. By 4 o'clock, they'd closed all the outdoor decks and the captain came back on. This time his voice had lost that casual tone, telling everyone to return to their cabins immediately and wait for further instructions. I couldn't stay in my cabin though, not with what I was seeing through that porthole. Waves that would disappear the entire view, then drop away to show nothing but angry gray water in every direction. I made my way up to Deck 5 where the main dining hall was, figuring if things went bad, I wanted to be somewhere with multiple exits, not trapped in a metal box 7 floors down. The dining hall was this massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows, crystal chandeliers. Must have had seating for 500 people easy, and right now it had maybe 30 confused passengers sitting at tables, trying to eat dinner while plates slid around despite the staff's attempts to steady them. That's when the first big wave hit. Not just rough seas anymore, but something that made the entire ship lurch sideways so hard that a grand piano on the stage broke free from its restraints and slid across the floor like it weighed nothing, crashing into the wall with a sound I'll never forget. Everything changed in seconds. Tables flipped, glass shattered everywhere, and people went tumbling across the floor mixed with food, broken dishes, and furniture that had become deadly projectiles. An elderly woman near me got thrown from her chair and slid 15 feet before hitting a pillar, her husband crawling after her while the ship tilted at an angle that shouldn't have been possible. The emergency alarm started blaring, this piercing electronic shriek that mixed with human screams and the sound of everything that wasn't bolted down, crashing from one side of the room to the other. I managed to grab onto a support column, helped pull a young couple behind it just as another wave hit from the opposite side, and this time I heard something structural give way, a deep groaning of metal that you feel in your bones more than hear. The lights flickered and went to emergency power, casting everything in this sick yellow glow, and through the windows all you could see was water, not sky and horizon like normal, just solid walls of black water rushing past like we were underwater. A crew member, this Filipino kid who couldn't have been older than 25, came stumbling through the chaos with blood running down his forehead, screaming for everyone to put on life jackets, pointing toward an emergency station near the entrance. Half the passengers couldn't even stand up with the ship rolling like it was, and I watched in horror as another massive wave visible through the window seemed to pause at the glass for a moment before smashing through, sending freezing seawater flooding across the dining hall floor. People were sliding in the water now, tables floating, and I heard someone yelling that water was coming up from the lower decks through the stairwells. The ship would tilt so far to one side that you were basically standing on the wall, then slam back the other way, and each time it happened, you could hear things breaking deep in the ship's belly. Expensive things, important things, maybe vital things. I managed to reach the life jacket station, started throwing the orange vests to anyone I could reach while trying to keep my footing on the floor that had become a river of seawater mixed with broken glass and debris. There was this family from somewhere in the Midwest, parents with 2 teenage kids, all 4 of them huddled together behind an overturned table. The father's arm bent at an unnatural angle, the mother holding a cloth napkin against a gash on her daughter's leg. I helped them into their life jackets, showed them how to pull the straps tight, and that's when the captain's voice came over the speakers again, except this time he was shouting the words nobody wants to hear on a ship. This is not a drill. All passengers and crew to muster stations immediately. Repeat, this is not a drill. The way he said it, you could hear the fear underneath the training, and that scared me more than the waves or the tilting or even the water rushing in. We tried to move as a group toward the muster station, but another wave hit, and suddenly the lights went out completely for about 10 seconds that felt like hours. Just total darkness, with invisible water sloshing around your legs, and people screaming from every direction. When the emergency lights kicked back on, I saw that the water in the dining hall was now waist-deep and rising fast, and through what was left of the windows, these waves that had to be 40, maybe 50 feet high, just mountains of water with white peaks that would lift the entire ship up like a toy before dropping it into the next valley. An older man next to me was having a panic attack, couldn't breathe, kept saying his wife was still in their cabin on deck 3, and I had to physically hold him back from trying to go down there because we could all hear it now. The sound of water rushing through the lower parts of the ship, doors banging open and closed, the deep creaking of a massive structure being pushed beyond what it was designed to handle. Getting to the muster station became like something out of a nightmare, where you're trying to run but can't move fast enough. We were basically climbing along the walls when the ship tilted, then sliding back down when it righted itself, all while fighting through water that was getting deeper by the minute. I saw a woman get swept away from her husband's grip, carried by the water toward the shattered windows, and 3 of us formed a human chain to pull her back, her face white with terror, coughing up seawater. The crew members who were supposed to be managing the evacuation looked just as terrified as the passengers. These young people who'd probably only ever done this in calm water drills, now faced with a ship that felt minutes away from rolling over completely. One of them, a girl with a thick Eastern European accent, was crying while she tried to do a head count. Her clipboard dissolved into wet pulp, mascara running down her cheeks as she kept repeating the evacuation protocols like a prayer. By the time we reached the muster station on deck 4, the situation had gone from dangerous to apocalyptic. The lifeboat area was chaos, with crew members trying to lower boats while the ship pitched so violently that the boats would swing out over the water, then come crashing back into the side of the ship. I watched one lifeboat get crushed like an aluminum can against the hull, just destroyed in seconds, and realized with this cold certainty that we might not have enough functional boats left, even if we could launch them. People were fighting to get closer to the remaining boats, families getting separated, and I saw a man push an elderly woman down to get ahead, the veneer of civilization disappearing as fast as our chances of survival. The wind was howling so loud you had to scream to be heard, rain coming sideways like bullets, and every few seconds another wave would sweep across the deck, taking anyone who wasn't holding on to something and washing them toward the railings or worse. That's when I heard it, the sound that made even the crew members stop what they were doing. This tremendous metallic shriek from somewhere below, followed by a shudder that ran through the entire ship like it had been punched by God himself. The floor beneath us suddenly tilted past 45 degrees and stayed there. People sliding down the deck in a tangle of bodies in life jackets, some going straight over the rail into the black churning ocean below. I managed to wrap my arms around a support pole, holding on while my feet dangled in the air, watching in absolute terror as the horizon through the rain seemed to be rotating, the ship beginning what felt like a slow-motion roll that would flip us completely. Water was pouring in from everywhere now, not just waves but from inside the ship itself, geysers shooting up through drain grates, cascading downstairs, and I could hear the engines making sounds they should never make, like dying animals trapped in the engine room. For 30 seconds, that lasted a lifetime. We hung there on the edge of capsizing, 2,000 people holding their breath, prayers in a dozen languages mixing with the storm's roar, waiting to see if we'd complete that roll into the Mediterranean. Then, impossibly, the ship started to right itself, fighting back against the storm with whatever was left of its stabilizers and the captain's desperate maneuvering, the deck slowly becoming horizontal again, though nothing felt stable or safe. A crew member with a radio was yelling that the Greek Coast Guard was 8 miles out, helicopters already in the air, and rescue ships pushing through the storm toward our position, but 8 miles in seas like this might as well have been 800. We spent the next 3 hours in pure survival mode, helping injured passengers, forming human barriers to keep people from getting washed overboard, bailing water with anything we could find while the ship limped along, lower in the water with each passing hour but somehow still floating. When the first helicopter appeared through the rain, its searchlight cutting through the darkness like salvation itself, people started crying, collapsing with relief, though we all knew it would take dozens of trips to evacuate everyone, and the ship was still taking on water faster than the pumps could handle. They evacuated the injured and elderly first, winching them up into helicopters that danced in the wind like leaves, and I stayed until almost the end, helping load people into rescue baskets, keeping panicked passengers calm while water lapped at our feet on what used to be the upper deck. It took 14 hours to get everyone off the Celestial Dream, and I was in one of the last groups to leave, watching from the rescue ship as our cruise liner, lit up by emergency floodlights from the Greek vessels, finally gave up its fight and slipped beneath the surface just after dawn. Nobody died that night, which the news kept calling a miracle, though 43 people ended up hospitalized and hundreds more with injuries that didn't make the statistics. They flew us to Athens, put us up in hotels, and cruise line representatives with practiced sympathy and liability waivers came around offering compensation and free future cruises that nobody in that room would ever take. I got home to Chicago 2 days later, Megan meeting me at O'Hare with tears streaming down her face, holding me like I might disappear if she let go. She'd seen the news coverage, those helicopter videos of the ship tilting at impossible angles, passengers clinging to railings while waves swept the decks, and she kept apologizing for pushing me to take the trip, which broke my heart because none of it was her fault. The official investigation blamed it on a rare meteorological phenomenon, a sudden pressure drop that created hurricane-force conditions in minutes, something that happens maybe once a decade in the Mediterranean. But knowing the science behind it doesn't stop the nightmares where I'm back on that tilting deck, watching people slide toward the rails, hearing that metal shriek that meant we were seconds from becoming another maritime disaster documentary. I still can't watch cruise ship commercials, and when friends talk about their vacation plans, I just nod and change the subject. Because how do you explain that 22 years of running into burning buildings didn't scare you half as much as one afternoon when nature decided to remind 2,000 tourists that the ocean doesn't care about your shuffleboard schedule or dinner reservations? "5 months ago, I was just another burned-out ICU nurse desperately needing a break from 12-hour shifts, and the constant beeping of monitors. After watching 3 patients code in a single week at the hospital in Houston where I worked, I finally cashed in 2 years' worth of savings and booked myself on a 7-day cruise through the Eastern Caribbean. The Ocean Jewel was one of those massive ships you see in commercials. 16 decks of pure escapism with pools, restaurants, and enough activities to make you forget that the real world even existed. I remember standing at the port in Port Canaveral, staring up at this floating city and thinking that for once in my life, I was going to completely disconnect and just let myself breathe. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. Morning yoga on the upper deck, afternoon margaritas by the pool, and dinner at restaurants where I didn't have to eat standing up between patient rounds. Everything changed on the 3rd night, somewhere between the Bahamas and our next port. I'd gone to bed early after too much wine at the captain's dinner, one of those fancy affairs where they parade the officers around and everyone pretends they're not already sunburned and exhausted. My cabin was on deck 7, nothing special but comfortable enough, with a tiny balcony where I could sit and watch the dark ocean roll by. Around 2:47 a.m., I know the exact time because I'd developed that nurse habit of always checking the clock when something wakes me. I heard what sounded like someone running full speed down the corridor outside my door. Then came the screaming, not just one voice but several, the kind of raw, terrified sounds that make your whole body go rigid. In the ICU, you learn to differentiate between types of screams, and these weren't drunk party guests having too much fun. These were people in genuine distress, and before I could even think about it, my feet were on the floor, and I was pulling on the jeans I'd thrown over the chair. The corridor was chaos when I cracked open my door. 3 cabins down, a middle-aged couple stood in their doorway, the woman clutching a torn nightgown to her chest while her husband had blood running from a gash above his eyebrow. Their cabin door hung at an odd angle, the lock mechanism completely destroyed like someone had taken a crowbar to it. Further down, I could see at least 2 more cabin doors standing wide open, and there was this weird chemical smell in the air, sharp and medicinal, that reminded me of the chloroform we'd studied in nursing school but haven't used in decades. A younger woman, maybe early 20s, was sitting on the floor against the wall, her wrists marked with deep red lines where zip ties had clearly been, and she kept repeating the same thing over and over. They had master keys. They had master keys. The emergency lighting had kicked on, casting these harsh shadows that made everything look even more nightmarish than it already was. What really made my gut twist was seeing the crew members who responded. 2 security officers showed up after what felt like forever, but was probably only 4 or 5 minutes, and instead of immediately calling for backup or starting to document the scene, they began ushering people back into their cabins, almost aggressively insistent that everyone needed to return to their rooms for their own safety. One of them, a tall guy with a Baltic accent and a name tag that read Dimitri, kept telling us there had been a minor disturbance and that everything was under control. But I could see into the Hamiltons' cabin. I'd met them at the pool bar the day before, a retired couple from Arizona celebrating their 40th anniversary, and their entire room had been ransacked. The safe had been pried open, clothes were everywhere, and Mrs. Hamilton was sitting on the bed with her hands still bound behind her back with those white zip ties that left deep marks in her skin. The security officer actually tried to block my view when he saw me looking, physically stepping between me and their doorway while insisting I needed to go back to my cabin immediately. Against every instinct screaming at me to help, I let them push me back toward my room, but not before I caught sight of something that made everything click into place. Near the emergency exit at the end of the corridor, there was a maintenance cart, one of those gray rolling things the housekeeping staff use, except this one had what looked like electronic equipment piled on top, the kind of signal jammers I'd seen demonstrated at a hospital security conference about protecting patient data. The cart was partially covered with a standard cleaning tarp, but I could see the corner of what was definitely a commercial-grade lock-picking gun, the expensive type that can open most hotel-style card readers in seconds. When Dimitri noticed me staring, he actually grabbed my upper arm, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to make his point, and walked me back to my cabin personally. His partner, a shorter woman whose badge I couldn't read in the dim light, was already on her radio speaking in rapid Portuguese, and I distinctly heard her say something about damage control in English before switching back. I spent the next hour sitting on my bed with the door locked and a chair wedged under the handle, listening to the sounds outside gradually die down. My phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual in the middle of the ocean, but the ship's Wi-Fi was mysteriously undergoing maintenance when I tried to connect. Around 4 a.m., an announcement came over the PA system from someone claiming to be the hotel director, explaining that there had been an unfortunate incident involving a disturbed passenger who had been apprehended and confined. And they assured everyone that the situation was completely under control and that counseling would be available in the morning for anyone affected. But here's what that announcement didn't explain: why I could hear at least 5 different cabins reporting thefts when I pressed my ear to the door, or why the couple from cabin 7043 was describing 3 attackers, not 1. It definitely didn't explain why I heard that same security officer, Dimitri, telling someone on his radio to make sure the service elevator cameras stay off until we're done cleaning up. The next morning, the main dining hall was eerily normal, like someone had hit a reset button on the entire ship. Waiters smiled and poured coffee. The breakfast buffet gleamed under warming lights, and that same cheerful cruise director who'd been leading poolside games was making announcements about the day's activities in St. Thomas. But at least a third of the tables were empty, and those of us who did show up kept exchanging these knowing looks, like survivors of something we weren't supposed to talk about. I found the Hamiltons sitting in a corner booth, Mrs. Hamilton wearing long sleeves despite the warming morning sun, probably to hide the marks on her wrists. When I approached them, Mr. Hamilton immediately tensed up, but his wife grabbed his hand and nodded for me to sit. She leaned in close and whispered that they'd lost everything: passports, cash, her grandmother's wedding ring, about $12,000 worth of jewelry they'd brought for their anniversary. The security team had taken their statement at 5 a.m., she said, making air quotes with her fingers, and told them they'd be compensated through insurance if they signed some papers and agreed not to discuss the incident with other passengers to prevent panic. That's when things got really interesting. A man at the next table, close enough to overhear, turned around and introduced himself as Paul, a cybersecurity consultant from Seattle. He pulled out his phone and showed me something he'd managed to capture before the ship's Wi-Fi went down. A crew member's Facebook post from 2 days earlier, written in Tagalog but which he'd translated, joking about easy targets and big score coming. The crew member worked in guest services, had access to the passenger manifest, and knew exactly which cabins had elderly couples traveling with valuables. Paul had also noticed something I'd missed. 3 crew members had suddenly fallen ill that morning and been confined to quarters, including one from the security team. He'd overheard the staff captain telling another officer that they needed to contain this before we dock, and that corporate would handle it internally. Paul had been trying to reach the FBI through a satellite phone he'd borrowed from another passenger, but mysteriously, all outside communications were being blocked, supposedly due to technical difficulties. By noon, our little group of aware passengers had grown to about 15 people, all comparing notes in hushed conversations around the ship. A woman named Janet from cabin 7039 revealed that she'd actually seen her cabin steward, a guy she'd been tipping generously all week, standing in her doorway at 2:30 a.m. with 2 other men she didn't recognize. When she screamed, they'd run, but not before she noticed one of them carrying what looked like a master key card on a lanyard marked "Security Override." Another passenger, a retired cop from Philadelphia named Frank, had done some investigating of his own and discovered that the cameras on Deck 7 had been undergoing maintenance for exactly the window when the attacks occurred, from 2:30 to 4 a.m. He'd also noticed that several of the crew members who'd been most friendly and chatty during the first 2 days were suddenly nowhere to be found, and when he'd asked about one particular room steward, He was told the man had been transferred to another deck just that morning. The pattern was becoming undeniable. This wasn't some random crime of opportunity, but a coordinated operation that required inside knowledge, master keys, and the ability to manipulate the ship's security systems. The breaking point came when we reached St. Thomas that afternoon. As the ship prepared to dock, Paul and I watched from the upper deck as 3 crew members were quietly escorted off through a service gangway, not the main passenger exit. They were wearing civilian clothes and carrying duffel bags, trying to blend in with the dock workers, but I recognized one of them. It was the woman who'd been with Dimitri the night before, the one speaking Portuguese on the radio. When a group of us tried to disembark to file a police report with local authorities, we were told that due to administrative issues, passengers from Deck 7 were temporarily restricted from leaving the ship. The hotel director himself came down to explain that this was for our protection while they worked with proper channels to investigate. But Janet had managed to slip out through a crew exit and made it to the police station, only to be told that the cruise line had already contacted them about a minor theft that was being handled internally, and that maritime law meant they had no jurisdiction unless we could prove physical assault had occurred on U.S. territory. The officers seemed strangely uninterested in taking her statement, and she overheard one of them mention something about not wanting to disrupt tourism relations with the cruise company that brought millions of dollars to their port. That evening, as we sailed away from St. Thomas, Frank organized what he called a documentation party in his suite. About 20 of us gathered with whatever evidence we'd collected: photos of damaged doors, recordings of suspicious radio chatter that some passengers had captured on their phones, screenshots of crew social media posts, and written accounts of everything we'd witnessed. A woman named Dorothy, who worked as a paralegal back in Indiana, helped everyone write detailed statements with times, dates, and specific descriptions. We used Frank's military-grade satellite phone, which he'd hidden in a locked Pelican case, to upload everything to a cloud server and email copies to the FBI, Coast Guard, and several news outlets. The ship's administration must have figured out what we were doing, because suddenly there was a knock on the door, and the hotel director appeared with 4 security officers, including Dimitri, claiming they'd received a noise complaint, and that gatherings of more than 10 passengers in a single cabin were against safety regulations. They tried to confiscate our phones and cameras, saying they needed them as evidence for their internal investigation, but Frank stood his ground, reminding them that they had no legal authority to seize personal property without a warrant, and that any attempt to do so would be considered theft. Ironic considering the circumstances. For the remaining 3 days of the cruise, it was basically a standoff. They couldn't throw us off the ship without creating an even bigger incident, and we couldn't force them to properly investigate their own crime ring. But here's what ended up happening. When we finally docked back in Port Canaveral, there were 2 FBI agents and a Coast Guard investigator waiting at the gangway, thanks to Frank's connections and the evidence we'd transmitted. 17 passengers from Deck 7 filed official complaints, and the local news picked up the story after Paul leaked it to a tech journalist friend who had a huge Twitter following. The cruise line initially tried to spin it as an isolated incident involving a single rogue employee. But when the FBI found over $200,000 in stolen goods in a crew storage area and detected that the security system had been deliberately sabotaged using admin access codes, they had to open a full investigation. 3 months later, I got a call from a federal prosecutor telling me that 11 crew members had been arrested, including 2 security supervisors and a guest services manager who'd been running this racket on multiple cruise lines for years, specifically targeting elderly passengers with valuable anniversary or retirement gifts. The cruise line quietly settled with all the victims out of court, paying way more than what was stolen just to keep us from talking to more media outlets. Though obviously that ship has sailed, pun intended, since I'm sharing this story now. I was fresh out of high school when my closest friends and I decided to book a cruise as a graduation trip. There were 5 of us: Ethan, Claire, Jordan, Emily, and me. And we figured a week at sea would be the perfect way to mark the end of one chapter and the start of another. My life back then was simple: part-time job at a grocery store, college applications hanging over my head, and that restless energy of wanting something bigger. The cruise was supposed to be our escape, one last stretch of freedom before responsibility caught up with us. The ship itself felt like a floating city: bright casinos, all-night buffets, pools stacked on different decks. We spent the first couple of days bouncing from one activity to another, barely sleeping, drunk on the novelty of it all. But the vibe shifted late one night when Claire and I wandered past a staff corridor near the lower decks. We weren't supposed to be there, but the door to a service stairwell had been left propped open. That's where we heard 2 crew members talking in hushed voices. Their accents were different, but one phrase cut through clear: "The morgue compartments are already too full." At first I thought I'd misheard. A morgue on a cruise ship wasn't something I'd ever considered. Claire grabbed my arm, eyes wide, and whispered, "Did you hear that?" We stood frozen in place, listening. One of the men sighed and said, "We'll have to mark the rest as medical incidents. No space left." They moved farther down the hallway before we could catch more. Claire wanted to bolt back upstairs immediately, but I convinced her to act normal. We told the others what we heard, and Ethan laughed it off, saying every ship had a morgue for emergencies. Jordan, though, looked unsettled and muttered, "Too full? That doesn't make sense." The strangeness turned into something darker a couple of nights later. Emily got into a heated argument with a bartender after she accused him of shortchanging her. She wasn't drunk, just stubborn and loud when she felt wronged. A supervisor stepped in, a tall man with slicked back hair and an expression that stayed unreadable no matter what Emily said. The fight fizzled out eventually, but not without her muttering she'd report him to guest services. That was the last time we saw her. The next morning, her bed was empty, her phone left charging by the nightstand, and none of her belongings looked disturbed. We reported Emily missing right away, but the response from the staff felt rehearsed. The supervisor she argued with claimed she'd been seen leaving a lounge with new friends around midnight, even though none of us remembered her saying anything about meeting anyone. The ship's security assured us they'd make announcements and check surveillance, but no announcement ever came. When we pressed again, they insisted she must have disembarked during a port stop, something that didn't add up, since all of her things were still in the cabin. It felt like we were being pacified instead of helped. That night, Ethan suggested we split up and quietly look around the restricted areas. He was half joking, but the longer we sat in that tiny cabin staring at Emily's untouched shoes by the door, the less like a joke it felt. Jordan managed to charm a cleaning lady into pointing out where the cruise access elevators went. Claire and I took one of them down, timing it between staff runs. The air grew colder the deeper we went, the carpet giving way to plain steel floors. When the doors opened, the smell hit us first. Industrial cleaner mixed with something metallic and sour, faint but undeniable. We didn't get far. A man in uniform rounded the corner, eyes narrowing the second he saw us. He asked what we were doing there, his voice calm but with an edge that made it clear we weren't welcome. Claire blurted something about being lost, and he walked us back up without another word. The silence on that elevator ride was suffocating. He didn't scold us, didn't threaten us, just stared straight ahead like we didn't exist. When we returned to the cabin, Ethan and Jordan were waiting, pale-faced. They claimed they'd overheard 2 crewmen talking by the loading bay about moving another one before morning. By the following day, rumors started circulating among passengers. Someone said a young woman had fallen overboard. Another insisted it was a medical evacuation. None of it matched what we knew. When we asked security again about Emily, they repeated the same vague line about her choosing to leave. Jordan lost his temper and shouted at them, only to be threatened with confinement for disrupting order. That's when it clicked for all of us. Emily wasn't coming back, and whatever was happening below deck was being carefully hidden behind official-sounding excuses. Ethan insisted we had to get proof, even if it meant risking being caught again. That night, we waited until the hallways were quiet and slipped back toward the service elevators. Jordan had swiped a room key left unattended on a cart, which surprisingly worked on the lower levels. We kept our phones ready, flashlights off, hearts pounding so hard I could feel mine in my ears. The air down there wasn't just cold, it felt heavy, the kind of atmosphere where every sound echoes too loudly. Behind one locked door, faint humming of machinery mixed with what sounded like refrigeration units. When we reached the end of a narrow corridor, we saw a metal door slightly ajar. Ethan nudged it open just enough for us to peek inside. Stainless steel drawers lined the walls, and in the dim light we caught the unmistakable sight of toe tags. There were more than I could count in those few seconds. Claire let out a gasp that she couldn't stifle, and the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the frame. A shadow moved in the reflection of the steel. Someone had been inside. Without saying a word, we bolted back to the elevator, praying the stolen key still worked. It did, but just barely. The next morning, security knocked on our cabin door. They claimed an incident report had been filed against us for trespassing in restricted areas. We played dumb, insisting we'd been in the casino all night. But the officer's eyes lingered on each of us long enough to make it clear we were being watched. The rest of the cruise blurred into paranoia. We stuck together constantly, avoided staff, and barely spoke above a whisper in case someone was listening. Emily's name never appeared in the daily bulletins. It was as if she'd been erased. When the ship finally docked, we packed up and walked off without looking back. No one contacted us, no investigation followed, and her disappearance was eventually dismissed as a runaway case. Even now, years later, the sound of those crew members whispering about compartments too full hasn't left me. I can still see Emily's phone, screen glowing with a half-written message she never sent. We told her parents everything, but without proof, it sounded like wild paranoia. And maybe that's what the ship counts on, that people like us go home, too scared and powerless to fight back. I booked that cruise because it was the cheapest way to see a bit of the world during my college break. The ship wasn't fancy by any means. Paint chipped in a few places, corridors narrow enough that two people had to shuffle sideways to pass each other. But I figured it didn't matter. My cabin was small, with a single bed pressed against the wall, a desk with a loose drawer that squeaked when I opened it, and a porthole that looked out onto nothing but endless gray water. It wasn't glamorous, but for someone traveling alone on a tight budget, it felt like enough. I spent the first day exploring, eating at the buffet, and reminding myself this was supposed to be relaxing. On the second night, I returned to my cabin after dinner and noticed a small folded piece of paper lying just inside the door. At first, I thought maybe housekeeping had left a note about towels or something trivial. But when I unfolded it, the words were handwritten in shaky block letters. "Don't trust the crew." That was it. No signature, no explanation, nothing else. I remember staring at it for several minutes, trying to decide whether this was some stupid prank, or if it was even meant for me. The handwriting looked rushed, like whoever wrote it was in a hurry. I didn't mention it to anyone at first. I slipped the note into my backpack and tried to brush it off, but the thought of it followed me around the ship. Every time a crew member smiled and asked how my day was, I wondered if they knew something I didn't. I tried to act normal, but I found myself scanning faces, watching body language, noticing details I would never usually notice. A man polishing glasses at the bar who never once looked up. A steward in the hallway who seemed to hover outside certain cabins for longer than necessary. It felt like I'd been pulled into some secret I wasn't supposed to know. By the next morning, another note appeared under my door. This one said, "They'll deny everything. Stay quiet." That rattled me more than I want to admit. I finally worked up the nerve to take both notes to the purser's desk, thinking someone would take it seriously. Instead, the woman behind the counter gave me a polite laugh, said passengers sometimes imagined things at sea. and told me not to worry. She slid the notes back toward me as if she didn't even want to hold them. Walking away, I felt embarrassed, like I'd been dismissed as paranoid, but a part of me couldn't shake the warning. After that encounter, I tried convincing myself it was just someone's idea of a joke, but things started to feel different around the ship. During breakfast, I noticed a guy I'd chatted with the day before, a student from another state traveling solo too, wasn't at his usual spot. I figured he overslept, but then at lunch he wasn't there either. By dinner, his chair remained empty, and no one mentioned him. No announcement, no casual. He disembarked early. He was just gone. The next day, it happened again with a woman I'd seen frequently reading by the pool. She always wore this wide-brimmed hat, easy to spot in a crowd. Suddenly, she wasn't there anymore. Her lounge chair stayed empty, her towel never picked up. I remember walking the deck in circles, half expecting to catch sight of her somewhere else, but she had vanished just as completely as the first guy. At that point, I started paying closer attention to who was traveling alone. A few of them simply stopped appearing. That night, I returned to my cabin and found a third note pushed under the door. My chest tightened the moment I picked it up. This one read, "You're not next, yet. Stay alert." That word, yet, sat in my head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. I barely slept, and every time I heard footsteps outside my door, I stared at the crack of light under it, waiting to see if another shadow paused there too long. The hum of the engines that once felt comforting now sounded like a warning, constant and heavy. I tried reporting it again, this time to a different officer at the reception desk, but he just brushed it off as seasickness messing with my head. "People get restless out here," he said, practically ushering me away. I walked off, clutching the notes, feeling both foolish and terrified. If the crew wouldn't believe me, who was I supposed to trust? The ship felt huge, but suddenly it was shrinking around me. Every hallway another place someone could be waiting. Every closed door a reminder of those passengers I never saw again. By the fifth day, I stopped trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The dining hall felt emptier, though no one else seemed to acknowledge it. Families laughed, couples posed for photos, and the crew kept smiling like nothing unusual was happening. I kept scanning for familiar solo travelers and coming up short. The absence was deafening. My own meals turned mechanical. I barely tasted the food, too focused on counting who was still around. Late that evening, I caught sight of two crew members guiding a young man I'd noticed traveling alone toward a stairwell at the far end of a corridor. He didn't look drunk, but his steps were unsteady, like he was reluctant to follow. When he glanced back, his face carried something I'll never forget, like he wanted to call out, but knew it wouldn't matter. Before I could react, the crew ushered him around the corner and out of sight. That was the moment I knew the notes weren't just warnings. They were facts. I spent the rest of that night barricaded in my cabin, dragging the desk and even the chair against the door. Every creak in the hallway made me hold my breath. No new note appeared, but that almost made it worse. The silence pressed down harder than the scribbled threats ever had. I didn't sleep until the sun filtered faintly through the porthole, turning the ocean pale blue. The ship docked 2 days later, and I walked off with nothing but my backpack, barely stopping to breathe until I was on solid ground again. To this day, I don't know what happened to those missing passengers. No official report, no news stories, nothing I could find afterward. It's like they were erased. I still have the 3 notes tucked inside a notebook at home, the handwriting uneven and smudged where my fingers clutched them too tightly. Sometimes I wonder why whoever wrote them chose to warn me at all. Maybe I was just lucky. Or maybe I was one step away from being the next name nobody ever mentioned again. I signed up for that cruise because it was the cheapest option my friends and I could find. And honestly, it felt like the kind of spontaneous trip college kids are supposed to take. We weren't chasing luxury, just a chance to be out on the water, sharing a cramped cabin, splitting costs and pretending we were adults on vacation. I remember the ship looking older than I expected when we boarded. the paint dull, the metal railings already showing patches of rust, but we laughed it off. At that point, the only thing on my mind was how surreal it felt to be out at sea with my friends, away from assignments and campus noise. The first 2 days were uneventful, just sun, crowded buffets, and awkward conversations with strangers at shared tables. I spent most of that time with my roommate for the trip, Leah, who had this restless energy, always darting off to explore different decks, always dragging me along to see the view from up here, or what's happening down there. She kept saying it felt like something was brewing, pointing out how the sky never seemed fully clear, even when everyone else was sunbathing. I shrugged it off, assuming she was just overthinking. We were young and convinced nothing serious could touch us out there. Everything shifted on the third night. Dinner had just ended when an announcement crackled over the speakers, cutting through the usual chatter. The captain's voice was steady but clipped, telling us that a storm had taken an unexpected turn. It wasn't supposed to be anywhere near our path, but now it was heading straight for us. People laughed nervously at first, but when the crew started handing out instructions with tight expressions, the tension spread fast. Leah gave me this sharp look like she'd been right all along, and for the first time, I felt the air in the ship thicken with dread. By midnight, the ship was no longer gliding, it was groaning. Each swell hit us like a giant hand shoving the entire vessel sideways. Hallways tilted, plates shattered somewhere below us, and every wall seemed to rattle in protest. The lights flickered on and off until eventually they cut out completely. Imagine hundreds of passengers stumbling in total darkness, the sound of water rushing where it shouldn't be, and the metal around you straining with every wave. I clutched the railing outside our cabin door so hard that my knuckles went numb, convinced the next crash would split the ship in half. Leah and I tried to make our way toward the stairwell, but the floor pitched so violently that we slid into the wall more than once. People were shouting in the dark, voices echoing off the narrow corridors, some calling for family members, others just screaming with each jolt. A crew member passed us with a flashlight, barking instructions that were lost under the crash of water slamming against the hull. For a moment, I could smell the seawater before I felt it. Cold, rushing under the cabin doors, spreading fast across the carpeted hallway. We finally reached a railing near one of the main decks, clutching it alongside dozens of strangers who all wore the same expression of raw fear. The ship tilted so far that the horizon outside looked vertical, a wall of water looming higher than anything I thought possible. Every impact made the metal under our feet shriek, like the vessel itself was crying out. I remember gripping Leah's arm so tight that she yelped, but neither of us dared let go. It felt like the only thing keeping us tethered to reality was that railing. The blackout stretched on, broken only by the weak glow of emergency lights that flickered sporadically, never enough to see clearly. Somewhere deeper inside, alarms wailed in uneven bursts, then cut out abruptly. I kept thinking about how no one had prepared us for this. Cruises had safety drills, sure, but nothing about standing in darkness while waves tossed the ship like a toy. Each second felt like it might be the last before something gave way, before we were all swallowed whole. Hours blurred together in that chaos. Time didn't move normally. It stretched and warped with every groan of the ship's frame. At some point, Leah whispered, "We're not making it out of this." And I couldn't bring myself to argue. I just pressed my forehead against the cold metal railing and listened to the water slam and recede, over and over like the countdown to something final. I thought about my parents, about the ridiculous decision to save money on this trip, about how no one on land even knew what we were going through in that exact moment. When the storm finally eased, it wasn't a gradual calm. It was like the sea suddenly exhaled. The violent shudders became dull tremors. The crashing turned into uneasy lapping, and for the first time in hours, silence spread across the decks. Emergency lights flicked back on, revealing pale faces and soaked clothes. People clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck, even though we were technically still afloat. I remember releasing the railing and being surprised my arms still worked, every muscle stiff from holding on. The crew eventually guided us back toward the interior, though most of the hallways were ankle-deep in water. Cabin doors hung crooked on their frames, and belongings floated past like debris in a flooded basement. Leah and I stumbled into our room to find our beds overturned, the ceiling tiles sagging from leaks. The air smelled like salt and diesel, sharp and heavy, sticking to my lungs with each breath. I don't think I slept at all that night. I just sat upright, waiting for the ship to start shaking again. The next morning, we learned that the storm had changed course so suddenly that the captain had no choice but to ride it out. Some people called him reckless, others called him a hero, but none of that mattered to me. What mattered was that the ship had held barely, and that I had stared at the ocean in its most violent form, and lived to tell about it. I remember watching the sunrise from the deck, the horizon calm and golden, as if the nightmare hours before had been a hallucination. But the warped metal railings and shattered windows were proof it had been real. Even now, years later, I can still feel that night whenever I hear strong winds outside my apartment, or when I walk past a building creaking in bad weather. It's not just the memory of fear, it's the helplessness, the realization that you're at the mercy of forces far bigger than yourself. That trip was supposed to be carefree and cheap, just another story from college. Instead, it left me with a memory I can't shake, of clinging to cold metal in the dark, waiting for the sea to decide whether I would live or not.